Welcome back, where we dive deep into gaming's greatest stories and transform them into soothing bedtime tales. If you enjoy these deep dives into epic lore, please hit that subscribe button. It truly helps more than you might think and allows me to keep creating these immersive journeys through gaming's most fascinating worlds. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary voyage through one of the most complex and devastating timelines in all of gaming. The complete story of how the Golden Lands between fell into chaos and how that chaos eventually gave rise to the eternal Nightreign. Over the next few hours, we'll explore the catastrophic Shattering that destroyed a divine empire, follow the desperate wars between demigods that scarred reality itself, and discover how these ancient conflicts eventually led to the emergence of the Nightfarers and their endless hunt through the transitory realm of liminal. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this epic journey through time. From the moment a mother's grief shattered the cosmos, to the establishment of an eternal cycle, where heroes must face the darkness that never truly ends. Chapter 1. The Golden Age before the Fall. Before we can understand the horror of the Shattering and the strange realm it would eventually birth, we must first appreciate the majesty of what was lost. The lands between under Queen Marika, the Eternal's rule, had experienced what scholars would later call the Golden Age of the Erdtree. This was an era of unprecedented prosperity, where the golden light of the great tree reached every corner of the realm, bringing order, life, and divine grace to all who dwelt beneath its protective boughs. Queen Marika the Eternal stood at the center of this golden empire, not merely as a ruler, but as a living goddess. She was the vessel of the Elden ring, that cosmic symbol of order that gave structure to reality itself. Through her divine authority, the fundamental laws of existence were written and enforced. Death was held at bay, banished and sealed away, so that those blessed by grace could live in eternal service to the Golden Order. The very concept of mortality had been conquered, or so it seemed to those who basked in the tree's eternal light. Under Marika's reign, the greater will, that incomprehensible cosmic force from beyond the stars, had found the perfect vessel through which to impose its vision of order upon the world. The Erdtree, massive beyond mortal comprehension, stretched toward the heavens like a golden spear piercing the sky itself. Its roots delved deep into the earth, spreading the influence of the Golden Order to every corner of the lands between, from the smallest village to the mightiest castle. From these roots, the blessed would return upon death, reborn in eternal service to the divine hierarchy that Marika had established. Death became not an ending, but a transition, a temporary separation before reunion with the golden light. This promise of eternal life gave the people hope and purpose, binding them to the cosmic order through love rather than fear. The architecture of this golden age was magnificent to behold. Lendel, the royal capital, rose like a crown of gold and marble beneath the Erdtree's protective embrace. Its towers and ramparts gleamed with divine light, while the streets bustled with merchants, nobles, and clergy, all united in their devotion to the Golden Order. The city was a living testament to what mortals could achieve when guided by divine wisdom and blessed with immortal purpose. Throughout the realm, other great cities flourished under the tree's influence. Raya Lucaria, the Academy of Sorcery, became a center of learning, where the mysteries of the cosmos were studied and understood within the framework of the Golden Order. The fortress city of Redmane Castle stood as a bulwark against external threats, its red-clad soldiers trained to perfection in the arts of war, and the underground cities carved deep beneath the earth, shared in this prosperity, their inhabitants blessed with grace and purpose. At the heart of this golden empire stood Marika's family, the demigod children, who served as living embodiments of different aspects of divine authority. Each possessed power that exceeded mortal understanding, yet each was bound by love and duty to the cosmic order their mother represented. Godwyn the Golden, firstborn among them, exemplified the noble virtues of the Golden Order. His very presence brought hope and inspiration to all who served beneath him. Strong yet compassionate, wise yet humble, he represented everything the Golden Order promised its faithful followers could become. Radahn, the mighty general, commanded the realm's military forces with skill that bordered on the supernatural. His mastery of gravity magic allowed him to accomplish feats that defied natural law, yet he used these powers always in service of protecting the innocent and maintaining the peace his mother had established. The sight of him riding into battle on his beloved horse, Leonard, holding back the very stars themselves to protect his people, became the stuff of legend throughout the realm. Ricard, master of Volcano Manor, governed the realm's more esoteric pursuits with wisdom and restraint. His knowledge of forbidden arts was matched by his understanding of why such knowledge needed to be carefully controlled and directed toward beneficial ends. Under his guidance, even the most dangerous forms of magic were channeled toward protecting and enriching the realm. These were not merely powerful beings ruling through might alone, but a family united by love and shared purpose. They understood that their divine nature came with divine responsibility to shepherd the mortal realm toward ever greater heights of prosperity and spiritual enlightenment. The harmony between them reflected the cosmic harmony their mother had established throughout reality itself. The common people of this golden age lived lives that their ancestors could never have imagined. Famine was unknown, for the Erdtree's blessing ensured that crops grew in abundance and livestock thrived. Disease was rare, as the grace that flowed through the realm strengthened both body and spirit against corruption. War was a distant memory, for who would dare challenge an empire blessed by cosmic forces and protected by demigods whose power exceeded that of entire armies? Trade flourished along roads protected by divine blessing, connecting distant regions in networks of commerce and cultural exchange. Artisans created works of beauty that seemed to glow with inner light, inspired by the golden radiance that suffused their world. Scholars and priests worked together to decode the mysteries of existence, always discovering new reasons to celebrate the wisdom and benevolence of the cosmic order they served. Yet even in this golden age, there were signs that careful observers might have interpreted as warnings. The very perfection of the system created a kind of stagnation, a sense that everything that could be accomplished had already been achieved. Some of the more thoughtful demigods began to question whether eternal stability was truly the highest possible good, or whether growth and change might be necessary even for divine beings. The exile of the Tarnished during this period reflected these growing tensions within the Golden Empire. These warriors, blessed with grace yet somehow incomplete, were cast out not because they had failed the Golden Order, but because their very existence suggested that the Order itself might not be as perfect and eternal as its adherents believed. Their banishment was an attempt to preserve the illusion of cosmic perfection by removing those who embodied its contradictions. Meanwhile, in the depths beneath the realm, older powers stirred in their ancient prisons. The forces that had been defeated and sealed away when the Golden Order was first established had not been destroyed, merely contained. The very act of maintaining these seals required constant vigilance and tremendous spiritual energy, resources that had to be diverted from other purposes as the centuries passed. The perfection of the Golden Age was also its greatest weakness. A civilization that had conquered death, eliminated scarcity, and achieved perfect order had also eliminated the challenges that drive growth and adaptation. When crisis finally came, it would find a realm that had grown complacent in its perfection, unprepared for the possibility that even divine order might prove fragile when tested by forces it had not anticipated. But for now, in these final years before the fall, the lands between basked in golden light, and the future seemed as eternal and unchanging as the great tree itself. The people looked up at its impossible heights and saw the promise of forever, never imagining that forever might be less permanent than they had been taught to believe. Chapter 2. The Conspiracy in Shadow. Beneath the golden perfection of the Eternal Queen's reign, a different kind of power was stirring. Princess Rani, the witch, had always been different from her demigod siblings, more contemplative, more questioning, more willing to look beyond the comfortable certainties that defined their world. While her brothers and sisters concerned themselves with maintaining and expanding the Golden Order, Rani's studies had led her down darker paths, toward truths that challenged the very foundations of their mother's empire. Rani's investigations into the nature of fate and free will had revealed something that filled her with both horror and determination. The Golden Order, for all its apparent benevolence, was ultimately a cosmic prison. The greater will's influence had not brought true peace and prosperity, but rather a kind of beautiful stagnation, where all possibilities were constrained within predetermined patterns. The very immortality that seemed like the greatest gift was actually the most insidious trap. Souls bound forever to a single destiny, unable to grow or change or choose different paths. This revelation might have remained merely philosophical, if not for Rani's discovery of the true nature of her own fate. Through her mastery of lunar sorcery and her connection to hidden cosmic forces that predated the greater will's dominance, she had glimpsed the future that awaited her. She was destined to serve as an eternal agent of the Golden Order's will. Her consciousness merged with cosmic forces that would use her power to maintain the status quo for countless eons to come. The prospect of such a fate was unbearable to someone of Rani's independent spirit. She had inherited from her mother a will strong enough to reshape reality, but unlike Marika, she chose to use that will, not to maintain order, but to shatter it entirely. If she was to be a prisoner of fate, then she would break fate itself rather than submit to its chains. But destroying the cosmic order that governed reality was not something that could be accomplished through force alone. The Golden Order had endured for millennia precisely because it was integrated into the fundamental structure of existence itself. To break it would require careful planning, profound sacrifice, and the creation of forces capable of operating outside its influence entirely. Rani's first step was to fake her own death, using forbidden arts that she had discovered in her studies of the ancient civilizations that predated the Golden Order. She separated her soul from her flesh, allowing her physical form to die while preserving her consciousness in a form that existed outside the normal patterns of life and death. This separation freed her from the cosmic constraints that bound other demigods, giving her the ability to act in ways that the Golden Order could not predict or prevent. From this hidden state of existence, Rani began to assemble the tools she would need for her great work. She forged alliances with forces that had been marginalized or oppressed by the Golden Order, beings who had their own reasons for wanting to see the current cosmic hierarchy overthrown. Chief among these was her collaboration with the forces of destined death, that primal power which the Golden Order had banished but never truly destroyed. The creation of the Black Knives was perhaps Rani's greatest achievement in the art of cosmic rebellion. These assassins were more than merely skilled killers. They were living weapons specifically designed to violate the fundamental laws that governs the Golden Order. Their blades, imbued with fragments of destined death, could kill even immortal beings, bringing true and permanent ending to those who had been promised eternal life. But creating the weapons was only part of the challenge. Rani also needed to ensure that her conspiracy would target the right victim at the right moment to achieve maximum devastation to the cosmic order. The death of just any demigod would certainly cause shock and grief, but it would not necessarily bring down the entire system. She needed to strike at someone whose death would create irreparable cracks in the foundation of reality itself. Godwyn the Golden represented everything that was purest and most beloved about the Golden Order. His death would not merely eliminate a powerful ally of the cosmic hierarchy, it would shatter the fundamental belief that the Order could protect those who served it faithfully. If even Godwyn could die, then the promise of eternal life that bound millions of souls to the Golden Order would be revealed as a lie. Moreover, Godwyn's position within the cosmic hierarchy made him a linchpin in the entire system. His divine nature was intricately connected to the Erdtree itself, and his death would create a kind of spiritual wound that would spread throughout the Golden Realm like poison through a healthy body. The very act of permanently killing someone who was supposed to be immortal would introduce a fundamental contradiction into reality, that the Golden Order would be unable to resolve. The timing of the assassination was also crucial. Rani understood that her mother's psychological state would determine how she responded to the crisis. Marika had maintained perfect composure throughout centuries of rule, but that composure was built on the assumption that her children were safe under the protection of cosmic law. The sudden, impossible death of her most beloved son would be more than just a personal tragedy. It would be a complete invalidation of everything she had built her identity around. Rani's psychological insight proved devastatingly accurate. She understood that Marika would respond to such a crisis, not with careful deliberation, but with pure emotional reaction. The Eternal Queen, faced with proof that her cosmic order had failed to protect what she loved most, would lash out against that order itself, in a moment of grief-driven fury. The Night of Black Knives was therefore not just an assassination, but a carefully orchestrated psychological operation designed to manipulate the most powerful being in existence into destroying her own creation. Rani's true target was never really Godwyn himself, but rather her mother's sanity and self-control. By killing the one person Marika could not bear to lose, Rani ensured that the Eternal Queen would do her work for her. The philosophical implications of Rani's conspiracy went far beyond mere political rebellion. She was attempting something that had never been tried before in recorded history: the deliberate destruction of a cosmic order for the purpose of freeing all existence from predetermined fate. Her vision of the future was not one where she would replace the Golden Order with something else, but rather one where no cosmic force would ever again be able to impose its will upon the universe. This vision required tremendous personal sacrifice from Rani herself. By triggering the Shattering, she would not only destroy the world she had known, but also ensure that she could never return to a normal existence. Her rebellion would mark her as an enemy of cosmic order itself, condemning her to eternal exile from any settled reality that might emerge from the chaos she was about to unleash. Yet for someone who valued freedom above all other considerations, even this price seemed worth paying. Better to face an uncertain future as a free agent than to submit to an eternal existence as a prisoner of fate, no matter how comfortable that prison might be. In Rani's eyes, the Golden Order's beauty was precisely what made it so dangerous. It was a trap that felt like paradise, making its victims grateful for their captivity. The success of her conspiracy would depend not only on her own planning and sacrifice, but also on the choices that others would make in response to the chaos she unleashed. She could not control what would emerge from the ruins of the Golden Order, but she could ensure that whatever came next would at least have the possibility of being different from what came before. As the Night of Black Knives approached, Rani prepared herself for the terrible responsibility of triggering the greatest catastrophe in recorded history. She had chosen to become the agent of cosmic change, knowing that history would likely remember her as a destroyer rather than a liberator. But sometimes, she reflected, destruction was simply the price that had to be paid for the possibility of genuine freedom. The stage was set, the weapons were forged, and the psychological trap was ready to spring. All that remained was to strike the blow that would shatter both an empire and the cosmic order that sustained it. Chapter 3: The Night of Black Knives. The date that would forever divide the history of the lands between, into, before, and after, began like any other night during the Golden Age. The Erdtree's light cast its familiar warm glow across Lendel, while the demigods went about their eternal duties, secure in the knowledge that their divine nature placed them beyond the reach of mortal concerns like danger or death. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, the instruments of cosmic revolution were already in motion, moving through shadow toward their terrible purpose. Godwyn the Golden had spent the evening, as he always did, in service to his people and his mother's vision of perfect order. He had reviewed reports from the distant borders, consulted with scholars about new discoveries in the nature of grace, and spoken with common citizens who had requested audiences with their beloved prince. His genuine care for even the humblest of his subjects had only strengthened over the centuries, making him seem more human rather than less, despite his divine nature. As night deepened and the golden light softened to a gentle amber glow, Godwyn retired to his chambers in the highest tower of the royal palace. He had no reason to suspect that this night would be different from any other, no warning that forces beyond his understanding had marked him for sacrifice in a cause he would never have supported had he known of its existence. The Black Knives moved through the palace with supernatural stealth, their forms seeming to blend with shadow itself as they navigated corridors that should have been impossible to penetrate undetected. These were not ordinary assassins, relying merely on skill and preparation. They were living violations of natural law, beings who existed partially outside the normal flow of reality, and therefore could act in ways that the Golden Order's defenses had never been designed to counter. Their leader bore the cursed blade that would change everything, a weapon forged from fragments of destined death and tempered in cosmic forces that predated the greater will itself. The knife hummed with malevolent power, eager to taste the blood of one who had been promised eternal life. It was a weapon of contradiction, designed to prove that even the most fundamental promises of the Golden Order could be broken by sufficient will and knowledge. The assassins encountered no guards as they climbed toward Godwin's chambers, not because the defenses had been overcome, but because they simply did not register as threats within the cosmic order that governed the palace's protective systems. Their existence outside the normal patterns of life and death made them effectively invisible to wards and barriers that had been designed to detect living intruders with hostile intent. When they finally reached the prince's door, they found it unbarred and unguarded. Godwin had never needed to fear assassination before, and the very concept of a weapon that could permanently kill an immortal being was so alien to the Golden Order's understanding of reality that no one had thought to prepare defenses against it. Godwin awoke to find dark figures standing over his bed, their faces hidden beneath hoods that seemed to swallow light itself. For a moment, he felt not fear but confusion. In all his centuries of existence, no one had ever threatened him directly. His first instinct was to question, rather than fight, to understand what had driven these beings to such a desperate act. "Who are you?" he asked, sitting up in bed, with the calm dignity that had always characterized him. "What grievance against the Golden Order drives you to such extremes? Surely there are better ways to seek redress than violence in the darkness." The assassins offered no reply. Perhaps they could not speak, or perhaps they understood that no words could justify what they were about to do. Their mission was not to debate the merits of cosmic order versus cosmic freedom, but simply to provide the spark that would ignite a conflagration across reality itself. The cursed blade descended without ceremony or ritual, piercing flesh that had been blessed by divine grace and protected by cosmic law. For an instant, reality itself seemed to hesitate, as if the universe was struggling to process an event that should have been impossible. Then the power of destined death flowed through the wound, spreading like ice through Godwin's immortal form. The prince's final words were not a curse or a cry for vengeance, but a question that would haunt the ruins of his empire. Why? He genuinely could not understand what could motivate such an act. What vision of the future could possibly justify destroying the peace and prosperity that the Golden Order had maintained for so long? But the assassins were already gone, melting back into shadow as quickly as they had emerged. They left behind only a corpse that should not have been possible, the lifeless body of one who was supposed to live forever. Physical proof that the most fundamental promises of the Golden Order had been lies. The discovery of Godwin's body sent shockwaves through the palace that went far beyond mere grief or political crisis. This was a rupture in the fabric of reality itself, evidence that the cosmic laws which governed existence were not as absolute as everyone had believed. Guards who found the scene wept not just for their fallen prince, but for the sudden understanding that their own promised immortality might be equally fragile. Word of the assassination spread through Lendel with supernatural speed, carried by servants and courtiers who could barely comprehend what they were reporting. In distant quarters of the city, people who had never met Godwin personally felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, as if something vital had been torn from the world's foundation. The Black Knives had accomplished far more than simple murder. Under interrogation, they revealed nothing about their ultimate master, but their very existence raised troubling questions that no one in authority wanted to confront. The fact that they were Numen, the same race as Queen Marika herself, suggested connections that reached into the highest levels of the government. Their weapons, clearly imbued with fragments of destined death, indicated access to powers that should have been beyond mortal reach. News of the assassination spread across the lands between, with supernatural speed, carried by ravens and riders who bore the terrible tidings to every corner of the realm. In distant keeps and isolated villages, people who had never seen Godwyn the Golden wept openly at the news of his death. He had been more than just a prince to them. He had been a symbol of hope, a proof that the Golden Order's promises were not empty lies. The psychological impact of Godwyn's death extended far beyond simple grief. For the first time since the establishment of the Golden Order, the common people were forced to confront the reality that even the gods could die. The immortality that had been promised to the faithful suddenly seemed less certain, while the cosmic hierarchy that placed the demigods above ordinary mortals appeared more fragile than anyone had imagined. Queen Marika's reaction to her son's death was immediate and devastating. According to those who witnessed her in the hours following the discovery of Godwyn's body, the goddess, who had maintained perfect composure through centuries of rule, was consumed by a rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The golden light that normally emanated from her divine presence flickered and twisted, taking on hues that spoke of fury and despair beyond mortal comprehension. In her grief and anger, Marika made a decision that would echo through the ages. Using the same hammer with which she had forged the Elden ring, she shattered the cosmic symbol that had given structure and meaning to existence itself. The act was not one of careful deliberation, but of pure emotional release, a mother's scream of anguish given form through divine power. The moment the Elden ring broke, reality itself convulsed. The golden light that had blessed the lands between for centuries dimmed and flickered, while the laws that governed existence became unstable and unreliable. Magic that had once been predictable became chaotic, while creatures and phenomena that had been held in check by cosmic order suddenly found themselves free to roam and multiply. Radagon, Marika's other self, immediately attempted to repair what she had destroyed. Using the same hammer that had shattered the ring, he tried desperately to piece together the fragments and restore the cosmic order that had given meaning to his existence. But the damage was too great, the fragments too scattered and corrupted by the violence of their breaking. His efforts, though heroic in their persistence, were doomed to failure from the beginning. The Greater Will's response to Marika's act of cosmic vandalism was swift and merciless. The entity that had elevated her to godhood and used her as its vessel for imposing order upon the world could not tolerate such open rebellion. Marika was imprisoned within the Erd-tree itself, her divine body crucified upon a rune-carved framework that would hold her until the end of time, or until someone with sufficient power chose to challenge the cosmic hierarchy directly. The punishment extended beyond mere imprisonment. The Greater Will withdrew its active support from the Golden Order, leaving the various institutions and hierarchies that had depended upon divine backing to fend for themselves. The grace that had blessed the faithful became inconsistent and unreliable, while the protection that had shielded the realm from external threats began to weaken and fail. The shattering of the Elden Ring had one final crucial consequence: the creation of the Great Runes. These fragments of cosmic power, each containing a portion of the original ring's authority, scattered across the lands between like seeds of chaos. They were drawn to those with the strength and ambition to claim them, the demigod children of Marika, who possessed the divine nature necessary to bear such tremendous power. Each great rune that found a new bearer transformed both the holder and their domain in ways that reflected their fundamental nature. Godric's Godric fragment enhanced his ability to graft the strength of others onto himself, turning his desperate hunger for power into a supernatural compulsion. Raiden's rune amplified his already formidable strength, while binding him more tightly to his role as protector of the realm. But the power came with a terrible price. The great runes were not merely tools to be used, but fragments of a broken cosmic order that carried within them the seeds of corruption and madness. Each demigod who claimed a rune found themselves changed by it, in ways that amplified their worst characteristics, while diminishing their capacity for wisdom and restraint. The Knight of Black Knives had achieved exactly what its architect had intended, the complete destabilization of the cosmic order that had governed the lands between for centuries. But like all acts of revolutionary violence, it had also unleashed forces that could not be controlled or directed by any single will, no matter how powerful or determined. The stage was now set for the greatest civil war in the history of the lands between, a conflict that would pit God against God, sibling against sibling, and ideal against ideal in a struggle that would leave the entire realm transformed beyond recognition. The Shattering had begun, not with the clash of armies or the siege of cities, but with a single act of violence that proved even the immortal could die. The die had been cast, and now all that remained was to see how they would fall. Chapter 4: The Breaking of Bonds. In the weeks and months following the Night of Black Knives, the lands between experienced a transformation that went far beyond the immediate political crisis. The shattering of the Elden Ring had created not just a succession dispute, but a fundamental breakdown in the cosmic order that had governed reality for centuries. The carefully maintained balance between different forces and factions began to collapse as the divine authority that had held everything together suddenly became uncertain and inconsistent. The first signs of breakdown appeared in the capital itself. Lendel, which had stood as a shining example of golden prosperity for millennia, began to show cracks both literal and metaphorical. The grand buildings that had gleamed with inner light now seemed dimmer and somehow less substantial, as if the divine grace that had strengthened their foundations was slowly draining away. Strange phenomena began to manifest in the lower districts. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, echoes of voices speaking words in forgotten languages, and doors that opened onto spaces that should not have existed. More troubling still was the effect on the people themselves. The citizens of Lendel had lived their entire lives in the certainty that death was merely a temporary inconvenience, that grace would restore them to life in service to the eternal order. Now faced with the evidence of Godwyn's permanent death, many began to question whether their own promised immortality was as secure as they had believed. This crisis of faith manifested in different ways. Some became obsessively devoted to religious ritual, hoping to secure their place in whatever cosmic order might emerge from the chaos, while others abandoned all restraint and indulged in behaviors that would have been unthinkable during the Golden Age. The royal court, once a model of divine harmony and shared purpose, fractured along lines that had been invisible when unified by common belief in their cosmic mission. Courtiers and administrators who had worked together for centuries suddenly found themselves questioning each other's loyalty and competence. Without the binding force of absolute certainty in their divine mandate, the personal ambitions and philosophical differences that had always existed beneath the surface began to emerge and harden into irreconcilable conflicts. The military forces stationed throughout the realm faced perhaps the greatest crisis of all. These warriors had sworn sacred oaths to protect the Golden Order and serve the Eternal Queen. But with the goddess imprisoned and the cosmic hierarchy in chaos, the meaning of those oaths became unclear. Some chose to maintain their allegiance to the established order, whatever its current difficulties. Others saw opportunity in the confusion and began to position themselves for the conflicts they sensed were coming. The common people, lacking the political sophistication to understand the full implications of what had occurred, simply knew that their world had changed in ways that filled them with dread. The golden light that had blessed their lives for generations now seemed uncertain and unreliable. Strange creatures began to appear in places where they had never been seen before, while familiar landscapes took on sinister aspects that spoke of corruption and decay. In the underground cities and hidden settlements, where dissidents and outcasts had gathered over the centuries, the news of Godwyn's death and the Elden Ring's shattering was received with emotions that ranged from jubilation to terror. Some saw in these events the beginning of the Golden Order's long overdue collapse, the first cracks in a system that had oppressed them for generations. Others understood that the chaos to come would likely consume the innocent along with the guilty, bringing suffering to all regardless of their political allegiances. The Knight of Black Knives had achieved exactly what its architect had intended: the complete destabilization of the cosmic order that had governed the lands between for centuries. But like all acts of revolutionary violence, it had also unleashed forces that could not be controlled or directed by any single will, no matter how powerful or determined. The stage was now set for the greatest civil war in the history of the lands between, a conflict that would pit God against God, sibling against sibling, and ideal against ideal in a struggle that would leave the entire realm transformed beyond recognition. The Shattering had begun, not with the clash of armies or the siege of cities, but with a single act of violence that proved even the immortal could die. The demigods themselves were perhaps the most immediately affected by the breakdown of cosmic order. Each had built their identity around their role within the divine hierarchy, and the sudden fragmentation of that hierarchy left them struggling to understand their place in a world where the fundamental rules had changed. The great runes that now called to them promised power beyond their previous dreams, but that power came with temptations and corruptions that would test the strength of bonds that had seemed unbreakable. Godric, always the most insecure among the demigods, felt the lure of the great rune most strongly. His entire existence had been defined by his awareness of his own inadequacy compared to his more accomplished siblings, and the prospect of claiming power that could remedy those inadequacies proved irresistible. When he finally claimed his fragment of the shattered Elden Ring, the transformation was both immediate and horrifying. The rune enhanced Godric's natural abilities beyond all reasonable proportion, but it also magnified his psychological flaws in equally dramatic fashion. His insecurity transformed into paranoid megalomania, while his desire for recognition became an insatiable hunger for power over others. Most grotesquely, the rune allowed him to literally graft the body parts of other beings onto himself, incorporating their strength, while discarding their identities entirely. But Godric's transformation was not merely physical. The great rune that empowered his grafting abilities also corrupted his mind, filling him with grandiose delusions about his own importance and destiny. He began to see himself not as the weakest of the demigods, but as their natural leader, the one who would unite all their strengths within his own enhanced form. This delusion would drive him to acts of increasing audacity and violence, as he sought to claim the power he believed was rightfully his. The other demigods watched Godric's descent into madness with a mixture of horror and calculation. Some, like Morgott, saw in his transformation a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Others, like Morgur, Mingyo Gi, viewed his corruption as proof that the old moral constraints were no longer relevant in a world where cosmic law had broken down. But all of them understood that his example demonstrated the kind of power that was now available to those willing to embrace it fully. Raidan's response to the crisis was characteristically direct and noble, at least initially. As the mightiest warrior among the demigods, he felt a responsibility to maintain order and protect the innocent during the turbulent times that followed the Elden Ring's destruction. His mastery of gravity magic, which he had originally developed to avoid crushing his beloved horse, Leonard, now became a tool for holding back cosmic forces that threatened to overwhelm the world entirely. The feat for which Raidan would be most remembered, his arrest of the movement of the stars themselves, was not an act of conquest, but of protection. The celestial bodies whose orbits had been regulated by the Elden Ring's cosmic authority now moved chaotically through the heavens, threatening to bring down meteors and other stellar catastrophes upon the inhabited lands below. Through sheer force of will and magical power, Raidan held them in place, sacrificing his own freedom and comfort to serve as a living barrier against cosmic destruction. But this act of selfless heroism came at a tremendous personal cost. The constant concentration required to maintain his gravitational hold on the stars left Raidan with little mental energy for other pursuits. He became increasingly isolated from his family and followers, spending long hours in solitary meditation as he struggled to maintain the cosmic barriers that protected the world. The cheerful, gregarious prince, who had once been beloved for his warmth and humor, gradually withdrew into himself, becoming a distant figure whose thoughts were always focused on threats that only he could perceive. His followers in Khaled began to worry about their lord's mental state, but they could not argue with the necessity of his sacrifice. Without his constant vigilance, the realm would have been devastated by cosmic catastrophes that would have made the political chaos seem trivial by comparison. Ricard's response to the crisis took a very different form. As a scholar and philosopher before he was a warrior, he understood that the breakdown of cosmic order represented both a catastrophe and an opportunity. The old certainties were gone, but that meant that new possibilities were emerging. Possibilities that had been constrained by the rigid structure of the Golden Order. Unlike his brothers, Ricard did not seek to preserve or restore the old order. Instead, he began to explore the implications of living in a world where the fundamental rules of existence had become fluid and negotiable. His studies led him into increasingly dangerous territory as he sought to understand and harness the chaotic forces that the Shattering had unleashed. The transformation that would ultimately consume Ricard began as a philosophical investigation into the nature of power and transcendence. He became fascinated by the possibility of achieving a form of existence that would be immune to the cosmic upheavals that were devastating the realm. This research led him to make contact with entities that had been banished from reality during the establishment of the Golden Order. Ancient powers that offered knowledge and strength in exchange for forms of service that grew increasingly demanding over time. Mogi's path to corruption was perhaps the most tragic of all, because it began with genuinely noble intentions. As one of the Omen, he had experienced firsthand the cruelty and injustice that the Golden Order could inflict on those who did not conform to its ideals of purity and perfection. The breakdown of cosmic order seemed to offer an opportunity to create something better, a realm where the outcast and despised could find acceptance and purpose. But Mogi's desire to help the oppressed was corrupted by his contact with the Formless Mother, an entity of pure chaos that fed on suffering and transformation. What began as a mission to liberate the downtrodden became a twisted obsession with forcing salvation upon others, whether they wanted it or not. His underground palace became a nightmare realm, where the distinction between rescue and imprisonment became increasingly meaningless. The corruption of the demigods was not merely a personal tragedy, but a cosmic catastrophe that affected the entire realm. Each great rune-bearer became a focal point for the chaotic forces that had been unleashed by the Shattering, their domains reflecting their psychological states in increasingly dramatic ways. Where once the lands between had been unified by shared purpose and cosmic order, now it became a patchwork of realities, each shaped by the madness and obsessions of its ruling demigod. As the months passed and the breakdown accelerated, it became clear that the crisis would not resolve itself through negotiation or compromise. The forces that had been unleashed were too powerful and too chaotic to be contained by conventional means. The stage was being set for a war unlike any that had ever been fought, a conflict where the very nature of reality would be at stake. Chapter 5. The First Battles. The transformation from cosmic crisis to open warfare was neither sudden nor clearly defined. Rather, it began with a series of smaller conflicts and territorial disputes that gradually escalated as the demigods realized that negotiation and compromise were no longer possible. The great runes that empowered them also isolated them from each other, creating barriers of mistrust and incomprehension that made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. The first major confrontation occurred between Raydan and Melania, though neither had initially sought conflict with the other. Both were among the most noble and heroic of the demigods, and under normal circumstances they might have worked together to restore stability to the realm. But the influence of their respective great runes, combined with the territorial pressures created by the breakdown of central authority, eventually made violence inevitable. The roots of their conflict lay in competing visions of how to respond to the crisis. Raydan believed that the highest priority must be defending the realm against external threats and cosmic catastrophes, even if that meant accepting temporary chaos in the political sphere. His focus on holding back the stars and maintaining the barriers that protected reality from otherworldly intrusion left him with little time or energy for the complex negotiations that might have prevented civil war. Melania, on the other hand, felt a deep responsibility to protect the common people who were suffering as the social order collapsed around them. Her domain in the far south had become a refuge for those fleeing the chaos that was spreading throughout the realm. But maintaining that refuge required resources and territory that were increasingly scarce. The logic of survival gradually pushed her into conflict with neighbors who might otherwise have been allies. The actual catalyst for their war was almost absurdly mundane, a dispute over trade routes and taxation rights that would have been resolved through diplomatic channels during the Golden Age, but with no higher authority to appeal to and no shared framework of law to guide negotiations. Even minor disagreements became potential causes of war. The first battle between their forces was fought in the borderlands between Caelid and the southern reaches of Melania's domain. Both commanders hoped that a single decisive engagement might settle the dispute without further bloodshed, but they had underestimated how fundamentally the Great Runes had changed the nature of warfare itself. Radahn's gravitational powers allowed him to manipulate the battlefield in ways that traditional military tactics could not account for. He could cause enemy cavalry charges to collapse under their own weight, redirect projectiles back at their sources, and even pull down meteors from the night sky to serve as weapons of mass destruction. His personal combat abilities had been enhanced to the point where he could engage entire armies single-handedly while riding his beloved horse. Leonard, who had been similarly enhanced to bear the tremendous gravitational forces that surrounded his master. But Melania was equally formidable in her own way. Her mastery of the sword was so complete that she seemed to dance through enemy formations, leaving trails of destruction that defied natural law. More ominously, her connection to the Scarlet Rote, a force of decay and renewal that had been awakened by the cosmic upheavals, gave her access to powers that could corrupt and transform anything they touched. The battle raged for 3 days and nights, with both armies suffering casualties that would have been unthinkable during the Golden Age. Divine beings fought with weapons of cosmic power, reshaping the landscape itself through the violence of their conflict. Mountains were leveled, rivers were diverted, and the very air became poisonous with the supernatural energies that were unleashed. On the final day, as both forces neared exhaustion, Melania made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her existence. Faced with the prospect of defeat and the failure of her mission to protect the innocent, she allowed the Scarlet Rote to consume her entirely, transforming herself into a living weapon of corruption and decay. The bloom of Scarlet Rote that erupted from Melania's transformation was unlike anything that had ever been seen in the lands between. It spread across the battlefield like a crimson tide, corrupting everything it touched and transforming soldiers into twisted parodies of their former selves. The very ground became diseased, while the air filled with spores that carried mutation and madness to any who breathed them. Radahn, despite his tremendous power, was not immune to the corruption. The Scarlet Rote infected him, even as he struggled to contain its spread, beginning a process of decay that would eventually destroy his mind, while leaving his body trapped in an endless cycle of growth and corruption. His great strength became a curse, as the disease used his own power to spread and multiply. Both commanders were ultimately defeated by their own victory. Melania's transformation had driven Radahn's forces from the field, but it had also destroyed her ability to protect the people she had sought to save. The southern lands were now uninhabitable, while she herself had become a creature of pure destruction, rather than the noble defender she had once been. Radahn, meanwhile, had contained the worst effects of the corruption, preventing it from spreading to the rest of the realm, but only at the cost of his own sanity and humanity. The noble general who had once been beloved for his warmth and humor became a mad beast, wandering the wasteland of Caelid and consuming everything in his path, as the Scarlet Rot slowly ate away at his mind. The aftermath of this battle sent shockwaves throughout the realm that went far beyond the immediate military consequences. The transformation of two of the most heroic demigods into monsters demonstrated that the corruption unleashed by the Shattering was not merely political or social, but spiritual and cosmic in nature. The very act of wielding divine power in warfare was proving to be inherently corrupting, transforming even the most noble beings into sources of destruction rather than protection. News of the battle and its horrific conclusion reached the other demigods through refugees and survivors who fled the contaminated battlefields. Each reacted according to their own nature and circumstances, but all understood that the conflict had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Godric saw in the mutual destruction of Radawn and Melania an opportunity to claim dominance over the realm. With two of the most powerful demigods effectively eliminated, he believed that his own grafted strength would be sufficient to overcome any remaining opposition. He began to gather forces and allies, preparing for a campaign of conquest that would unite the great runes under his control. Ricard, observing from his volcano Mana, drew very different conclusions. The corruption of noble intentions into monstrous results convinced him that traditional approaches to power and governance were fundamentally flawed. His research into forbidden arts accelerated as he sought forms of strength that would be immune to the spiritual contamination that had destroyed his siblings. Mogi retreated further into his underground realm, using the chaos above ground as cover for increasingly twisted experiments in forced transformation and artificial divinity. The suffering caused by the war provided him with endless raw material for his attempts to create a new cosmic order based on blood and obsession, rather than grace and law. The smaller conflicts that followed this first great battle were equally devastating, though none achieved quite the same level of mutual annihilation. Across the realm, armies clashed with weapons of divine power, while the common people fled or hid or died in the crossfire. Cities that had stood for millennia were reduced to ruins in single battles, while entire regions became uninhabitable due to the supernatural after-effects of divine warfare. Perhaps most tragically, the breakdown of communication and trust between the demigods meant that opportunities for reconciliation were repeatedly missed. Several attempts at negotiation were made during the early phases of the war, but the psychological changes wrought by the Great Runes made compromise increasingly impossible. Each demigod became convinced that only total victory could secure the survival of what they valued most, leading to an escalating cycle of violence that consumed everything in its path. The civil war had begun with noble intentions and reasonable grievances, but it was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous, a cosmic catastrophe that threatened to destroy not just the Golden Order, but the very possibility of order itself. The first battles had demonstrated that divine power, once unleashed in anger and desperation, created its own logic of escalation that mere mortals were powerless to control. Chapter 6. The War of the Great Runes. As the conflicts between individual demigods escalated into a realm-wide catastrophe, the nature of the war itself began to change in ways that none of the participants had anticipated. What had started as disputes over territory and resources evolved into something far more fundamental, a struggle for the right to define the very nature of reality itself. The great runes that empowered each faction were not merely weapons or tools, but fragments of cosmic law that could reshape existence according to the will and nature of their bearers. The transformation of warfare from a political necessity into a theological imperative was perhaps most clearly visible in the changing nature of the armies themselves. During the Golden Age, military forces had been composed primarily of mortal soldiers, led by officers blessed with grace. These armies fought according to established principles of strategy and tactics, seeking to achieve specific objectives through coordinated application of force. But as the Great Runes began to exert their influence more fully, the armies of the Shattering became something entirely different. Each force was gradually transformed to reflect the psychological and spiritual state of its commanding demigod, creating military organizations that operated according to principles that would have been incomprehensible to traditional commanders. Godric's forces exemplified this transformation most dramatically. As his obsession with grafting and incorporation grew stronger, his armies began to mirror his own twisted evolution. Soldiers under his command were encouraged, then required, to graft additional limbs and organs onto themselves in pursuit of enhanced combat effectiveness. The sight of these hybrid warriors, bristling with extra arms wielding multiple weapons, spreading terror across battlefields as much through their appearance as through their fighting prowess. But the grafting was not merely cosmetic. The Great Rune's influence meant that these modifications actually enhanced the bearer's capabilities in ways that violated natural law. A soldier with 4 arms could indeed fight more effectively than one with 2, while grafted eyes provided supernatural awareness and grafted legs granted inhuman speed. The price for these enhancements was the gradual loss of individual identity, as the grafted warriors became increasingly indistinguishable from each other and from their master. Moju's armies represented a different kind of transformation altogether. Rather than modifying their bodies, his followers underwent changes that affected their very souls. The blood rites that dominated his underground realm created soldiers who were bound to their commander through ties that transcended normal military discipline. These warriors fought with the fanaticism of religious converts, believing that death in service to their lord would grant them a form of twisted immortality. The battlefield techniques employed by Mogeg's forces were as disturbing as they were effective. Rather than seeking to kill their enemies outright, they attempted to capture and convert them through blood rituals that could transform even the most dedicated opponent into a faithful servant. Entire enemy units would disappear during battles, only to reappear weeks later, fighting for the other side with the same desperate enthusiasm they had once shown for their original cause. Ricard's approach to military transformation was perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated, if no less horrifying, in its implications. Rather than simply enhancing his followers' capabilities, he sought to transcend the limitations of individual existence entirely. His experiments with the serpent that would eventually consume him began as attempts to create a form of collective consciousness that could coordinate military action with perfect efficiency. The warriors who served Ricard gradually lost their individual personalities as they became part of a larger organizational entity. On the battlefield, they moved with the coordination of a single mind, anticipating each other's actions and responding to threats with inhuman precision. Enemy commanders found it impossible to predict or counter their tactics, as traditional military thinking simply did not apply to forces that operated as extensions of a single will. But perhaps the most tragic transformation was that which befell the forces that had once served Redan and Melania. These armies, composed of some of the most noble and heroic warriors in the realm, were gradually consumed by the corruptions that had claimed their commanders. Redan's followers became mindless beasts, driven by endless hunger and the need to consume everything in their path. Melania's warriors were transformed into vectors for the Scarlet Rot, spreading disease and mutation wherever they traveled. The environmental impact of these transformed armies was catastrophic. Regions where they fought did not simply suffer the normal devastation of warfare, they were fundamentally altered at the level of physical law. Areas where Godric's forces had campaigned became landscapes of impossible biological fusion, where trees grew weapons instead of leaves and rivers flowed with blood that retained the memories of those who had shed it. The territories controlled by Mocha became realms of perpetual twilight, where the boundary between life and death grew increasingly meaningless. Visitors to these regions reported encounters with beings that might have been the ghosts of fallen warriors or the dreams of the living. The distinction had become irrelevant in a place where reality itself was shaped by obsession and desire. Ricard's domain around Volcano Manor transformed into something that could barely be called landscape at all. The very concept of individual objects became fluid as everything within his influence began to merge into a single vast organism. Mountains developed nervous systems, while rivers began to exhibit something resembling thought processes. As the war progressed and these transformations accelerated, it became clear that the conflict was not simply destroying the old order, but replacing it with something entirely new and potentially worse. The Great Runes were not neutral tools that could be wielded for good or evil according to the intentions of their bearers. Instead, they were active forces that imposed their own logic upon reality, reshaping everything they touched, according to principles that human minds could barely comprehend. The few neutral observers who managed to survive and document these changes began to realize that the war itself had become secondary to the transformations it was unleashing. Victory or defeat in the traditional sense no longer mattered, because the very concepts of victory and defeat were being redefined by forces that operated outside normal causality. This realization led to increasingly desperate attempts to find some form of resolution that would prevent the complete dissolution of reality. Several surviving members of the Golden Order's bureaucracy attempted to organize peace negotiations, hoping that the demigods might be willing to set aside their differences in the face of cosmic catastrophe. But these efforts were doomed from the start, not because of political disagreements or personal animosities, but because the great runes had transformed their bearers into beings who could no longer communicate with each other in meaningful ways. The philosophical frameworks that allowed for negotiation and compromise simply did not exist in a world where each faction operated according to fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of existence itself. The few meetings that did take place descended quickly into surreal exchanges, where participants spoke past each other, unable to find common ground for even the most basic concepts. When Godric spoke of strength, he meant something entirely different from what Moog meant when he used the same word. The language itself had been corrupted by the cosmic forces that the war had unleashed, making mutual understanding impossible even for beings who had once been as close as family. As the second year of the Shattering drew to a close, it became clear that the conflict had entered a phase where traditional military victory was no longer possible. The transformed armies continued to clash across the scarred landscape, but these battles served more to accelerate the pace of cosmic change than to achieve any recognizable strategic objective. The realm that had once been unified under the golden light of the Erdtree was now a patchwork of realities, each shaped by the madness and obsession of its ruling power. The borders between these domains were not merely political boundaries, but fundamental discontinuities in the nature of existence itself. Travelers who crossed from one territory to another might find themselves subject to entirely different physical laws, while concepts like time and space became negotiable rather than absolute. Yet even as the old world dissolved into chaos, new forms of order began to emerge from the ruins. The transformations unleashed by the great runes were not entirely random or destructive. They were creating something unprecedented, something that might eventually stabilize into a new form of cosmic organization. Whether this emergent order would be better or worse than what had come before remained an open question, but it was becoming clear that there could be no return to the golden age that had been lost. The War of the Great Runes was no longer a conflict between competing visions of how the realm should be governed. It had become a process of cosmic evolution, guided by forces that transcended the understanding of any individual participant. The demigods who had begun the war as rational actors pursuing comprehensible goals had become instruments of change whose ultimate purpose was known only to the cosmic forces that wielded them. Chapter 7: The Scarlet Devastation. The aftermath of Millennia's transformation into the goddess of Rote created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield where she had faced Radahn. The Scarlet Rote that bloomed from her desperate sacrifice did not simply contaminate the physical landscape. It introduced a new principle of existence into the world, one that operated according to laws of decay and renewal that challenged the very foundations of what the Golden Order had tried to establish. In the weeks following the bloom, explorers and refugees reported phenomena that defied all previous understanding of how corruption and disease were supposed to function. The Scarlet Rote did not simply destroy what it touched, it transformed it into something new, something that retained echoes of its original form while becoming part of a larger organic network that seemed to possess its own alien intelligence. Trees infected by the rot developed new forms of consciousness, their branches reaching out with deliberate intention to spread the contamination further. Animals that succumbed to the disease did not die in any conventional sense, but rather became living vectors for the rot's expansion, their minds and bodies reshaped to serve purposes that had nothing to do with their original nature or instincts. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the effects on human beings who encountered the contamination. Unlike other forms of magical corruption that simply destroyed or mutated their victims, the Scarlet Rote seemed to offer a form of transcendence, a dissolution of individual identity that was experienced as liberation rather than death. Survivors reported feeling drawn to the contaminated zones, not from madness or despair, but from a genuine sense that the rot offered something valuable that the old world had lacked. This seductive aspect of the corruption made it far more dangerous than any conventional plague or curse. Where other forms of magical contamination could be resisted through will or faith, the Scarlet Rot appealed to deep psychological needs that the Golden Order had never adequately addressed. The promise of unity, of belonging to something larger than oneself, proved irresistible to many who had felt isolated and meaningless in the perfect but sterile world of divine order. Malenia herself, transformed beyond recognition by her sacrifice, became the focal point for these new forms of existence. No longer recognizably human or even demigod, she existed as a living embodiment of the principle that growth and decay were not opposites, but complementary aspects of a single cosmic process. Through her, the Scarlet Rot developed purposes and intentions that went far beyond simple destruction. The contaminated zones began to exhibit forms of organization that resembled nothing so much as a vast biological experiment. Different regions developed different characteristics as the Rot adapted to local conditions and resources. Some areas became gardens of impossible beauty, where flowers that had never existed before bloomed in colors that had no names, while other regions transformed into living architecture, where buildings grew from the ground, like trees, and modified themselves to meet the needs of their inhabitants. The military implications of these transformations were profound and terrifying. Traditional armies could not operate effectively in contaminated zones, as the very air and ground worked against anyone who had not been touched by the rot. Supply lines became meaningless when the landscape itself could provide those it favored, while actively hindering intruders. More importantly, the Scarlet Rot challenged the fundamental assumptions that military strategists had always made about territory and conquest. What was the point of capturing ground that would transform the conquerors as much as it was transformed by them? How could victory be defined when the enemy offered transcendence rather than mere death? Several of the other demigods attempted to mount campaigns against the contaminated regions, hoping to contain the spread of the rot before it could threaten their own domains. These efforts met with varying degrees of success, but all of them revealed the profound challenges involved in fighting an enemy that operated according to entirely different principles of existence. Godric's grafted warriors initially seemed well suited to combat in contaminated zones, as their modified bodies could incorporate aspects of the rot while retaining their basic functionality. But this apparent advantage proved to be a trap. The rot that they absorbed gradually began to influence their behavior and goals, turning them into unwitting agents of the very force they had been sent to destroy. Mosheg's blood-touched servants fared somewhat better, as their own transformations provided some resistance to the rot's influence. But even they found that prolonged exposure began to change them in ways that their master had not anticipated or desired. The blood rights that bound them to Mosheg's will began to compete with the collective consciousness that the rot encouraged, creating internal conflicts that made them unreliable in combat. Ricard's forces, already part of a collective entity, showed the greatest resistance to the rot's transformative effects. But this resistance came at the cost of making them unable to operate effectively in contaminated zones at all. Their artificial unity was too rigid to adapt to the fluid, organic nature of the Scarlet Rot's domain. As reports of these failed campaigns reached the other powers involved in the Shattering, it became clear that the Scarlet Rot represented a new kind of threat, one that could not be defeated through conventional military action. The contaminated zones were not simply enemy territory to be conquered, but alternative realities that challenged the basic assumptions upon which all other factions based their strategies and goals. This realization forced a fundamental shift in how the other demigods approached the continuing war. Rather than attempting to eliminate the threat that Malenia's transformation represented, they began to focus on containing it, while pursuing their own separate objectives. The Scarlet Bloom had effectively removed large portions of the realm from play, creating buffer zones that prevented direct confrontation between some factions, while making others impossible to reach through normal means. The psychological impact of the Scarlet Rot's existence extended far beyond its immediate area of influence. Knowledge that such transformation was possible, that a single act of desperate sacrifice could fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself, changed how everyone thought about the war and its potential consequences. The stakes were no longer simply political or territorial, but existential in the most literal sense. Common soldiers began to question whether the causes they fought for were worth the risk of such transformation. The loyalty that bound armies together became more fragile as warriors contemplated the possibility that victory might be indistinguishable from a fate worse than death. Desertion rates increased dramatically, not from cowardice or lack of faith, but from a rational assessment that the potential costs of continued fighting exceeded any possible benefits. The civilian populations caught between warring factions faced an even more complex dilemma. The approaching armies offered protection from immediate threats, but at the cost of potential involvement in conflicts that could lead to transformations that would erase their humanity entirely. Many communities chose to simply abandon their homes and possessions, fleeing to remote areas where they hoped to avoid contact with any of the supernatural forces that were reshaping the world. Yet even flight offered no guarantee of safety. The effects of the Shattering had destabilized reality throughout the realm, creating pockets of chaos and transformation that could appear anywhere without warning. Refugees reported encounters with phenomena that suggested the Scarlet Rot was not the only force of change that had been unleashed. It was simply the most visible and comprehensible. In some regions, the very fabric of space and time had become unreliable. Travelers might set out for a destination that was supposed to be a day's journey away, only to find themselves lost in landscapes that had never existed before. Others reported meeting people who claimed to be from villages that had been destroyed years earlier, or encountering children who possessed memories of events that had not yet occurred. The boundaries between dream and reality became increasingly permeable as the cosmic order that had once maintained clear distinctions between different levels of existence began to break down. Some areas became trapped in eternal loops, where the same events repeated endlessly, while others experienced time at vastly accelerated or decelerated rates that made normal life impossible. These phenomena made coordinated military action increasingly difficult for all factions involved in the conflict. Armies that set out for battle might find that their destination had ceased to exist, or that their enemies had been transformed into something that could not be fought through conventional means. Communication between different units became unreliable, as messages sent through areas of distorted reality might arrive weeks before they were sent, or centuries after the information they contained had become irrelevant. The cumulative effect of these developments was to make the war itself increasingly surreal and meaningless. Victories and defeats lost their significance when the territories being fought over might transform into something entirely different overnight. The great runes that had driven the conflict in its early stages began to seem less like tools of power and more like curses that trapped their bearers in cycles of purposeless violence. Yet the war continued, driven by its own momentum and the inability of any faction to find a way to withdraw from the conflict without accepting defeat. The demigods had become prisoners of the forces they had unleashed, unable to stop fighting even as they began to realize that the very concept of victory had become meaningless in a world where the rules of existence changed faster than any strategy could adapt to them. The scarlet devastation had demonstrated that the Shattering was not simply a political crisis or even a cosmic catastrophe, but a fundamental transformation of reality that would continue regardless of who won or lost the immediate conflicts. The old world was dying, and something new was being born from its remains, something that might be beautiful or terrible or both, but would certainly be unlike anything that had existed before. Chapter 8. The Long Stalemate. By the third year of the Shattering, the nature of the conflict had changed so fundamentally that many participants began to question whether it could still be called a war in any meaningful sense. The great battles that had marked the early phases of the crisis had given way to a grinding stalemate, where none of the major factions possessed the strength to achieve decisive victory, yet none was willing to accept the compromises that peace would require. The transformation of the demigods themselves had progressed to the point where many could no longer be considered the same beings, who had begun the conflict. Godric's obsession with grafting had consumed him so completely that his original personality existed only in fragments, scattered throughout his massively modified form. He had become less a person than a living collection of body parts, held together by will and magical compulsion, his identity shifting constantly as new grafts altered his mental processes, along with his physical capabilities. Ricard's evolution had taken a different but equally radical path. His experiments with transcendence had led him to allow himself to be consumed by the great serpent that had been the focus of his research, believing that this sacrifice would grant him a form of existence beyond the limitations that had trapped his siblings. The being that emerged from this union retained Ricard's memories and knowledge, but operated according to principles that had little relationship to human psychology or motivation. Moga's transformation was perhaps the most psychologically complex, as he had managed to retain more of his original personality while becoming something that was no longer recognizably human. His connection to the formless mother had given him powers that operated outside the normal boundaries of space and time, but at the cost of making him increasingly unable to relate to beings who existed within those boundaries. Even Morgoth, who had attempted to maintain his role as protector of the Old Order, found himself changed by the responsibility of defending a system that was collapsing around him. His efforts to preserve the Golden Order in the face of cosmic chaos had required him to embrace aspects of his own nature that he had previously suppressed, transforming him into a creature that embodied the contradictions inherent in trying to maintain order through violence. The armies that served these transformed demigods had evolved in equally dramatic ways. Traditional military hierarchies had broken down as supernatural influences reshaped the relationships between commanders and their followers. Some forces had become extension of their leaders' consciousness, while others operated as autonomous entities that pursued goals that might or might not align with their original purpose. The economic systems that had once supported large-scale warfare had largely collapsed under the strain of supplying armies that no longer operated according to normal logistical principles. Traditional supply lines became meaningless when soldiers could sustain themselves by consuming defeated enemies, or when weapons and equipment could be grown from the landscape itself rather than manufactured in conventional workshops. Trade between different regions became increasingly difficult as the boundaries between territories controlled by different factions became zones of distorted reality where normal economic relationships could not function. Merchants who attempted to cross these boundaries might find that their goods had transformed into something entirely different by the time they reached their destination, or that the currency they carried was no longer recognized by beings who had evolved beyond the need for conventional exchange. The civilian populations caught in the middle of these developments faced challenges that no previous generation had ever encountered. Communities that had once been part of a unified empire now found themselves isolated in pockets of reality that might operate according to completely different physical laws. A village that had been prosperous and well-connected might discover that the roads leading to it had ceased to exist, or that time moved at a different rate within its boundaries than in the surrounding countryside. Many settlements responded to these challenges by developing new forms of social organization that would have been unthinkable during the Golden Age. Some communities chose to embrace the transformations that were occurring around them, allowing their members to undergo modifications that would help them survive in the changed world. Others attempted to create bubbles of stability by cutting themselves off from outside contact entirely, hoping to preserve fragments of the old order until the chaos subsided. The most successful adaptations often involved forming alliances with the supernatural forces that were reshaping the landscape rather than trying to resist or ignore them. Villages that learned to work with the entities emerging from the Scarlet Road zones found that they could achieve levels of prosperity and security that exceeded what they had known during the Golden Age, though at the cost of accepting changes that would have horrified their ancestors. Religious and philosophical movements that had been suppressed during the Golden Age began to emerge from hiding as the authority of the Golden Order weakened. Ancient practices that had been driven underground found new relevance as people sought alternatives to cosmic systems that had proven themselves fallible. Some of these movements offered genuine wisdom and comfort, while others represented reactions to crisis that were as dangerous as the forces they claimed to oppose. The breakdown of central authority also created opportunities for new forms of governance to emerge. In regions where the old administrative systems had collapsed entirely, local leaders developed innovative approaches to maintaining order that drew on resources and principles that the Golden Order had never recognized. Some of these experiments were remarkably successful, creating pockets of stability and prosperity that served as beacons of hope in an otherwise chaotic world. However, the majority of attempts to create alternative systems of governance failed catastrophically, often due to the involvement of supernatural forces that the organizers did not fully understand. The power vacuum created by the Shattering had attracted entities from outside normal reality, beings that were eager to establish footholds in a world where the barriers between different planes of existence had become permeable. Communication between different regions became increasingly unreliable as the magical systems that had once carried messages across vast distances became disrupted by the ongoing cosmic upheavals. News of events in distant parts of the realm might take months to arrive, if it arrived at all, and by the time information reached its destination, it was often outdated or irrelevant due to the rapid pace of change. This breakdown in communication made coordinated action increasingly difficult for all factions involved in the conflict. Military campaigns that had been planned based on intelligence that was weeks or months old often found that the situation on the ground bore no resemblance to what had been expected. Political negotiations became nearly impossible when the parties involved could not reliably exchange proposals or responses. The isolation of different regions also meant that local variations in how the Shattering was manifesting became more pronounced over time. Areas that had been culturally and economically integrated during the Golden Age began to evolve in radically different directions as they adapted to their own unique combinations of challenges and opportunities. Some regions became locked in temporal loops, where the same events repeated endlessly, while others experienced accelerated change that compressed centuries of development into periods of months or weeks. The very concept of a unified realm began to lose meaning, as different areas became so thoroughly transformed that they might as well have been separate worlds entirely. Yet, even in this context of seeming chaos and fragmentation, larger patterns began to emerge. The various supernatural forces that had been unleashed by the Shattering were not entirely random in their effects. They were creating new forms of organization that operated according to principles that were alien to human understanding, but consistent within their own frameworks. These emerging patterns suggested that the stalemate was not simply a temporary pause in the conflict, but a transitional phase in the development of something entirely new. The old world was not merely being destroyed, it was being transformed into something that retained elements of its previous structure, while incorporating novel principles that had never existed before. The implications of this realization were profound and disturbing. If the stalemate represented a natural phase in the evolution of reality itself, then attempts to resolve the conflict through traditional means were not merely difficult, but fundamentally misguided. The war was not something that could be won or lost in any conventional sense. It was a process of cosmic change that would continue regardless of the intentions or actions of any individual participant. This understanding began to spread among the more thoughtful observers of the conflict, creating a sense of fatalism that made the stalemate even more entrenched. If the outcome was predetermined by forces beyond human control, then there seemed little point in making the sacrifices that would be necessary to achieve any particular resolution. As the third year drew to a close, it became clear that the lands between had entered a new phase of existence, one where the old certainties no longer applied and the new rules were still being written by forces that no mortal mind could fully comprehend. Chapter 9. The Abandonment. As the fourth year of the Shattering began, a new and terrible realization began to dawn upon those few scholars and observers who had managed to maintain some degree of objectivity throughout the cosmic crisis. The greater will that vast cosmic entity whose intervention had originally established the Golden Order, was withdrawing its attention and support from the lands between entirely. The abandonment was not sudden or dramatic. It was a gradual process that manifested as an increasing sense of cosmic indifference to the suffering and chaos that had consumed the realm. The first signs of this abandonment were subtle and easily dismissed as side effects of the ongoing conflict. The golden light of the Erdtree, which had dimmed significantly after the Shattering, began to flicker with an irregular rhythm that suggested failing systems rather than temporary disruption. The grace that had once flowed reliably to those who served the Golden Order became increasingly erratic, sometimes blessing individuals who had committed terrible acts while abandoning others who had remained faithful throughout the crisis. More disturbing still were the reports from the few remaining priests and scholars who had maintained their connection to the cosmic forces that had once guided the realm. Their prayers and rituals, which had once received clear responses from divine sources, now seemed to echo into an empty void. The sense of purpose and direction that had once characterized religious practice was replaced by a growing awareness that they were speaking to entities that were no longer listening. The withdrawal of divine attention had practical consequences that extended far beyond the spiritual realm. The magical systems that had once operated with clockwork precision became unreliable and dangerous to use. Sorcerers and clerics who attempted to channel cosmic forces found that their spells produced unexpected results, while enchanted items began to malfunction or lose their power entirely. The protective barriers that had once shielded the realm from external threats began to weaken and fail. Entities from other planes of existence, which had been held at bay by the greater will's influence, began to manifest in increasing numbers. These beings were not necessarily hostile, but they operated according to principles that were alien to everything the people of the lands between understood about reality. The boundaries between different levels of existence became increasingly permeable, creating opportunities for beings that had been banished during the establishment of the Golden Order to return from their exile. Ancient powers that had been suppressed for millennia began to stir in their prisons, sensing that the cosmic forces that had confined them were weakening. Perhaps most significantly, the fundamental laws that governed existence became unstable and negotiable. Physical principles that had been absolute constants during the Golden Age began to vary from place to place and time to time. Gravity might function normally in one location while operating in reverse. In an adjacent area, time could flow at different rates within the same room, while the distinction between dream and reality became increasingly meaningless. The demigods, already transformed beyond recognition by their great runes and the conflicts they had endured, found that their connection to cosmic authority was becoming increasingly tenuous. The power that had once flowed to them as divine inheritance now had to be actively maintained through constant effort and sacrifice. Some responded to this challenge by intensifying their pursuit of alternative sources of strength, while others began to question whether the power they had fought so hard to obtain was worth the price they had paid. Godric's response was characteristically desperate and self-defeating. Sensing that his divine nature was becoming unreliable, he accelerated his grafting experiments in an attempt to incorporate so many different sources of power that he would no longer depend on any single one. This strategy led him to graft increasingly exotic and dangerous entities onto his form, including fragments of cosmic beings that should never have been combined with mortal flesh. The result was a creature that possessed tremendous power, but had lost all coherent identity or purpose. Godric became a living chaos of competing influences and desires, his actions determined not by rational planning, but by whichever grafted element happened to be dominant at any given moment. His followers, observing their lord's descent into madness, began to abandon him in increasing numbers. Ricard, now more serpent than human, found that his connection to the ancient powers he had allied himself with was actually strengthened by the greater will's withdrawal. The forces that had been his enemies during the Golden Age now saw him as a potential ally in their efforts to reclaim influence over the realm. This development filled him with both triumph and terror as he began to understand the true scope of what he had unleashed. Mulhubda's situation was perhaps the most complex of all. His connection to the Formless Mother had always existed outside the normal hierarchy of cosmic authority, so the Greater Will's abandonment actually enhanced his relative position. However, this advantage came with the realization that he was now serving entities whose ultimate goals might be fundamentally incompatible with any form of existence that could be called civilized. The common people, lacking the supernatural perception necessary to understand the cosmic developments that were reshaping their world, experienced the abandonment primarily as an acceleration of the chaos and suffering that had already dominated their lives. The social institutions that had provided stability during the Golden Age continued to collapse, while new forms of organization emerged that were based on survival rather than principle. Many communities turned to increasingly desperate measures in their attempts to maintain some form of order. Blood sacrifices and other practices that would have been unthinkable during the Golden Age became commonplace as people sought to appease whatever forces might be able to provide protection. The moral framework that had once guided behavior became irrelevant in a world where the distinction between good and evil had lost its cosmic foundation. Yet the abandonment also created opportunities for forms of wisdom and understanding that had been suppressed during the Golden Age. Without the overwhelming presence of a single cosmic authority, other voices could finally be heard. Ancient traditions that had been driven underground began to resurface, offering alternative approaches to the challenges of existence that did not depend on divine grace or cosmic intervention. Some scholars and mystics began to explore the possibility that the abandonment was not a catastrophe, but an opportunity, a chance for the inhabitants of the lands between to develop forms of consciousness and organization that would not depend on external authority. This perspective suggested that the apparent chaos was actually a necessary phase in the evolution toward a more mature and self-directed form of existence. The Tarnished, those exiled warriors who had been stripped of grace and banished during Godwin's reign, began to experience the return of divine blessing for the first time in generations. But this restoration came not as a reward for faithful service, but as a desperate measure by cosmic forces that had exhausted all other options for restoring stability to a broken world. The irony that salvation would come from those who had been cast out and rejected was not lost on the few scholars and priests who survived to witness these developments. The return of the Tarnished represented an acknowledgement that the pure and blessed had proven themselves incapable of maintaining the order they had inherited. The individual Tarnished who began to return to the lands between found a world that bore little resemblance to the one they had left. The golden prosperity of the previous age had been replaced by a landscape scarred by magical warfare and populated by creatures that had been twisted into forms that violated natural law. The task that awaited these returning exiles was not simply to claim a throne or restore a government, but to reconstruct the fundamental basis of existence itself. The Elden Ring that had given structure to reality lay shattered, its fragments scattered among beings who had proven themselves unworthy of the power they wielded. The great runes that had empowered the demigods throughout the Shattering now served as both the keys to ultimate power and the sources of corruption that had made such power dangerous. Any attempt to restore cosmic order would require not merely collecting these fragments, but somehow purifying them of the taint that their bearers had accumulated. The survivors of the Shattering, who remained in the lands between, represented a population that had been traumatized beyond any previous experience in recorded history. The social bonds and cultural institutions that had sustained civilization for centuries had been shattered as thoroughly as the Elden Ring itself, leaving individuals and communities to face an uncertain future with only the most basic survival instincts to guide them. The environmental damage that the war had inflicted upon the natural world created challenges that would persist for generations, regardless of what political settlements might be achieved. The regions that had been transformed by magical warfare would require centuries to heal, if healing was possible at all. The knowledge and wisdom that had been accumulated during the Golden Age was largely lost, either destroyed in the fighting or corrupted by contact with the blasphemous forces that several factions had employed. The libraries and academies that had preserved learning for centuries were reduced to ruins, their contents scattered or consumed by supernatural fires. The infrastructure that had supported trade and communication across the continental empire was broken beyond any possibility of quick repair. The roads and bridges that had connected different regions lay in ruins, while the magical systems that had supplemented conventional transportation were too dangerous to use due to the cosmic instabilities that the Shattering had created. Perhaps most tragically, the hope and idealism that had once inspired people to believe in the possibility of just government and wise leadership had been extinguished by years of witnessing the worst possible expressions of power and ambition. The cynicism and despair that characterized the post-Shattering population would prove to be among the most difficult wounds to heal. The abandonment that gave this period its name was not merely political, but cosmic in scope. The greater will, which had invested so much effort in establishing the Golden Order, finally concluded that the experiment had failed beyond any possibility of redemption. The withdrawal of divine support left the lands between to face the consequences of their choices, without the safety net that had previously protected them from the worst outcomes. As the fourth year of the Shattering drew to a close, it became clear that the war had not ended through any victory or decisive resolution, but simply through the exhaustion of the participants' ability to continue fighting. The surviving demigods remained in their strongholds, still technically at war with each other, but no longer capable of meaningful military action. The silence that settled over the lands between was not the peace of resolution, but the quiet of desolation, broken only by the distant sounds of scavengers picking through the ruins of what had once been the greatest civilization the world had ever known. The Golden Age was over, and what would replace it remained a question that only the returning Tarnished could answer. Chapter 10. The Seeds of Nightreign. In the deepest depths of the cosmic wounds left by the Shattering, something unprecedented began to stir. While the surviving powers of the lands between focused their attention on the immediate aftermath of their devastating war, forces far older and more alien than even the greater will sensed an opportunity in the chaos. The barriers between realities that had been maintained for eons through careful cosmic architecture had been weakened to the point where entities from dimensions that operated according to entirely different principles could begin to establish footholds in the material realm. These were not the familiar forces of corruption and decay that had manifested during the war itself. The Scarlet wrote, the blood magic of Modi, even the serpentine transcendence that had consumed Ricard. All of these had emerged from sources that were at least tangentially related to the cosmic order that had once governed the lands between. What was now stirring came from realms so alien that they challenged the very concepts of existence and consciousness that mortal minds used to make sense of reality. The first manifestations were subtle enough to be dismissed as lingering after effects of the war. Travelers in the most devastated regions reported encounters with shadows that seemed to exist independently of any objects that might cast them. These shadows moved with purpose and intelligence, but they did not respond to light or darkness in ways that conventional shadows should. More disturbing still, observers who studied them too closely found that their own shadows began to exhibit similar anomalous behavior. In areas where the boundary between dream and reality had been damaged by supernatural warfare, people began to report shared nightmares that continued even after they awakened. These were not simply bad dreams, but coherent alternate realities where the participants retained full consciousness and memory of their experiences. Some individuals became so immersed in these nightmare realms that they lost the ability to distinguish between their dream experiences and their waking lives. The ancient ruins that dotted the landscape throughout the lands between structures that predated even the arrival of the Greater Will began to show signs of renewed activity. Chambers that had been sealed for millennia developed strange resonances that seemed to call to something beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. Scholars who investigated these phenomena discovered inscriptions in languages that had never been seen before, containing knowledge that they could somehow understand despite having no framework for translation. Perhaps most ominously, the concept of night itself began to change in fundamental ways. During the Golden Age, the cycle of day and night had been regulated by cosmic forces that ensured a predictable and comforting rhythm of light and darkness. But as the cosmic order continued to break down, night became something more than mere absence of sunlight. It became a realm unto itself, with its own rules and inhabitants. This transformation was most evident in the remote regions where the influence of the great runes was weakest. In these areas, night took on a quality of active presence rather than passive darkness. Travelers who found themselves caught outdoors after sunset reported that the darkness seemed to press against them with physical weight, while sounds and voices emerged from the shadows that had no identifiable source. The few surviving scholars who possessed sufficient knowledge of pre-Golden Order history began to piece together troubling connections between these new phenomena and fragments of ancient lore that had been suppressed for good reason. References to entities called Night Lords appeared in texts that predated the establishment of the Erdtree, describing beings that existed in the spaces between realities and fed on the fears and desires of mortals trapped in their domain. These ancient sources suggested that the Night Lords had once ruled over realms where the distinction between hunter and hunted was the only meaningful form of organization. In these nightmare kingdoms, existence was structured as an eternal hunt, where beings of immense power pursued lesser entities through landscapes that shifted and changed according to the will of their dark masters. The arrival of the Greater Will and the establishment of the Golden Order had supposedly banished these entities to dimensions so remote that they could no longer influence the material realm. But the cosmic wounds left by the Shattering had apparently created pathways that allowed them to begin extending their influence once again. The first concrete evidence of this intrusion came from the most devastated battlefields of the war, where the concentration of death and suffering had created conditions that the Night Lords found conducive to their purposes. Witnesses reported seeing figures of immense size and terrible beauty moving through the ruins, their presence causing reality itself to flicker and change like a candle flame in a wind. These beings did not interact with the physical world in ways that could be easily understood or predicted. They seemed to exist partially outside normal causality, able to affect events through methods that bypassed conventional physics entirely. Their influence manifested primarily through changes in probability and possibility. Unlikely events became common, while things that should have been certain became unreliable. More disturbing still was their apparent interest in the survivors of the Shattering. Rather than simply consuming or destroying the remnants of civilization, the Night Lords seemed to be studying them, learning about the forms of consciousness and social organization that had developed in their absence. This observation suggested that they had purposes beyond mere destruction, goals that required the continued existence of sentient beings who could serve their alien needs. The transformation of night from a natural phenomenon into an active force had practical consequences that affected everyone who remained in the lands between. Sleep became unreliable and dangerous as the boundaries between conscious and unconscious experience broke down entirely. People who tried to rest found themselves pulled into shared nightmare realms where they might encounter other dreamers from across the continent or beings that had never existed in any material form. These nightmare encounters were not merely frightening, they were transformative. Individuals who spent too much time in the altered states of consciousness that characterized the new form of night emerged with knowledge and abilities that they had never possessed before. Some gained insights into cosmic forces that allowed them to manipulate reality in limited ways, while others developed forms of perception that let them see through the illusions that normally concealed supernatural activity. However, these gifts came with a terrible price. The knowledge that mortals gained from contact with the nightmare realms was inherently corrupting, filling their minds with concepts and desires that were fundamentally incompatible with human psychology. Many individuals who developed supernatural abilities also began to lose their capacity for normal emotional connections, becoming isolated and increasingly alien to their former friends and family. The social implications of these developments were profound. Communities that had managed to survive the war intact found themselves facing new challenges as some of their members began to exhibit supernatural abilities and alien perspectives. The The trust and cooperation that were essential for survival became difficult to maintain when some individuals possessed powers that others could not understand or predict. In response to these challenges, new forms of organization began to emerge that were specifically adapted to existence in a reality where the supernatural had become commonplace. Some communities chose to embrace the changes that were occurring, allowing their members to undergo transformations that would help them navigate the new conditions. Others attempted to resist the alien influences through isolation and strict adherence to whatever fragments of the old order they could maintain. The most successful adaptations often involved the development of new traditions and practices that were specifically designed to provide protection against the nightmare influences that were spreading throughout the realm. These evolved from a combination of ancient lore that had been preserved in hidden traditions and hard-won experience gained through direct contact with the new threats. Groups of individuals who had developed supernatural abilities through their exposure to the nightmare realms began to organize themselves into hunting parties that could track and confront the entities that were manifesting throughout the landscape. These early Nightfarers, as they came to be known, possessed a combination of human determination and alien knowledge that made them uniquely suited to operating in the transformed reality. The development of organized resistance to the Night Lord influence represented a crucial turning point in the post-Shattering period. Rather than simply accepting the transformation of their world or fleeing from it, some survivors chose to actively engage with the new threats in an attempt to limit their impact on what remained of human civilization. This decision required tremendous courage and sacrifice, as confronting the nightmare entities meant voluntarily exposing oneself to forms of corruption and transformation that could easily destroy human consciousness entirely. The early Nightfarers had to develop techniques for maintaining their essential humanity while incorporating enough alien knowledge to function effectively in the changed world. The weapons and tools that these hunters developed were unlike anything that had existed during the Golden Age. Traditional arms and armor were largely useless against entities that existed partially outside normal reality, so the Nightfarers had to create equipment that operated according to principles borrowed from the nightmare realms themselves. These supernatural implements were as dangerous to their wielders as they were to their intended targets. The process of creating and using nightmare-touched weapons required the smith and warrior to accept forms of corruption that changed them in fundamental ways. Many early Nightfarers retained their essential humanity only through constant struggle against the alien influences that their equipment exposed them to. The emergence of organized resistance also attracted the attention of other forces that were beginning to manifest in the post-Shattering world. Entities that had been awakened by the cosmic chaos began to take notice of the mortals who were developing the capability to threaten them. This attention led to conflicts that were unlike any form of warfare that had previously existed in the lands between. The battles between Nightfarers and nightmare entities took place simultaneously on multiple levels of reality. Physical combat was accompanied by struggles for control over probability and causality, while psychological warfare involved attempts to corrupt or strengthen the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Victory or defeat in these conflicts could not be measured simply in terms of which participants survived, but required assessment of what forms of existence emerged from the encounter. As word of these developments spread throughout the remnants of civilization, it became clear that the post-Shattering world would require entirely new approaches to survival and organization. The old certainties were gone forever, but new possibilities were emerging that offered hope for those who possessed the courage and adaptability to embrace them. The transformation of the lands between into a realm where nightmare and reality coexisted was not merely a catastrophe to be endured, but a fundamental change that created opportunities for forms of existence that had never been possible before. The challenge facing the survivors was not simply to restore what had been lost, but to build something new from the alien materials that the cosmic crisis had made available. The seeds of what would eventually become the Nightreign had been planted in the deepest wounds left by the Shattering. Whether those seeds would grow into something that preserved the essence of humanity while incorporating the new realities, or whether they would produce forms of existence so alien that they could no longer be called human, remained to be determined by the choices and actions of those who would become the first generation of Nightfarers. Chapter 11. The First Nightfarers. In the years immediately following the cosmic abandonment, as the alien influences that would eventually establish the Nightreign began to manifest throughout the Shattered Realm, a new breed of warrior began to emerge from among the survivors. These individuals, who would come to be known as Nightfarers, represented humanity's first organized attempt to adapt to and ultimately resist the nightmare forces that were transforming their world. The transformation from ordinary survivor to Nightfarer was not something that could be achieved through training or instruction alone. It required a fundamental change in consciousness that allowed individuals to perceive and interact with entities that existed partially outside normal reality. This change was typically triggered by direct exposure to nightmare influences under circumstances that tested the limits of human psychological endurance. The first recorded Nightfarer was a former knight of Lendel, known only by the title, the Iron Revenant. During the final phases of the Shattering, this individual had been trapped for weeks in a region where reality had become unstable due to the proximity of multiple great rune bearers. The constant exposure to conflicting cosmic influences had driven most of his companions to madness or death, but somehow he had managed to retain his sanity while incorporating enough alien knowledge to function in the transformed environment. When rescue finally arrived, the Iron Revenant was found to possess abilities that defied conventional understanding. He could perceive entities that were invisible to normal sight, navigate through areas where space and time functioned according to altered rules, and most importantly, he could engage in combat with nightmare creatures using weapons that he had somehow learned to forge from the corrupted materials that littered the battlefield. The techniques that the Iron Revenant had developed through necessity and desperation became the foundation for the training methods that would eventually be used to create subsequent generations of Nightfarers. However, his knowledge came at a terrible personal cost. The corruption that had given him his abilities also isolated him from normal human contact, making him unable to relate to individuals who had not undergone similar transformations. This isolation was not merely social, but existential. The Iron Revenant's perception of reality had been fundamentally altered by his experiences, making it difficult for him to distinguish between events that were happening in the physical world and those that were occurring in the nightmare realms that had become accessible through the cosmic wounds. He could function effectively as a hunter of supernatural threats, but only by accepting a form of existence that was as alien as the entities he fought against. The recognition that the Iron Revenant's abilities might be essential for survival in the post-Shattering world led to the first organized attempts to create other Nightfarers through controlled exposure to nightmare influences. These early experiments were conducted in secret by survivors who possessed enough knowledge of the old magical traditions to understand the risks involved. The process of transformation was extremely dangerous and frequently fatal. Individuals who were exposed to nightmare influences without proper preparation typically succumbed to madness or corruption within hours of the initial contact. Even those who survived the immediate effects often emerged so changed that they could no longer function in human society. The key breakthrough in Nightfarer creation came when researchers discovered that the transformation process could be stabilized through the use of artifacts and rituals that had been preserved from pre-Golden Order traditions. These ancient practices provided frameworks for maintaining essential human consciousness while incorporating alien knowledge and abilities. The artifacts that proved most effective were items that had been created specifically for dealing with entities from outside normal reality. These included weapons forged from materials that existed partially in nightmare dimensions, armor that provided protection against psychological as well as physical attacks, and talismans that helped their bearers maintain clear distinctions between different levels of reality. However, the supply of such artifacts was extremely limited, and creating new ones required knowledge that had been largely lost during the Golden Age. The few craftsmen who possessed the necessary skills had to work with materials that were inherently dangerous to handle, and the creation process itself involved exposure to the same nightmare influences that threatened to corrupt their customers. The early Nightfarer communities that began to form around these craftsmen were unlike any social organizations that had existed during the Golden Age. Members were bound together not by shared cultural traditions or economic interests, but by their common need to resist the alien influences that their own abilities exposed them to. These communities developed practices and traditions that were specifically designed to help their members maintain their humanity while operating in nightmare-influenced environments. Daily rituals helped individuals distinguish between their authentic thoughts and feelings and those that might be influenced by alien entities. Group activities reinforced social bonds that could easily be eroded by the isolation that supernatural abilities tended to create. Perhaps most importantly, the Nightfarer communities developed codes of conduct that governed the use of their members' abilities. The power to perceive and manipulate nightmare forces was inherently corrupting, and without strict ethical guidelines, even well-intentioned Nightfarers could easily become as dangerous as the entities they fought against. The moral framework that emerged from these early communities was based on the principle that nightmare abilities should be used only for protection and resistance, never for personal gain or the domination of others. This principle was enforced through peer pressure and mutual surveillance, as community members understood that the corruption of any individual member could threaten the survival of the entire group. The weapons and equipment that the Nightfarers developed during this period reflected their unique needs and circumstances. Traditional arms and armor were largely useless against nightmare entities, but completely alien equipment could not be wielded by beings who retained any connection to human consciousness. The solution was to create hybrid implements that combined familiar forms with supernatural functionality. Nightfarer weapons typically appeared to be conventional swords, spears, or bows, but they were forged from materials that had been harvested from nightmare realms and treated with processes that imbued them with the ability to affect entities that existed outside normal reality. These weapons could wound or destroy nightmare creatures, but they also exposed their wielders to constant low-level corruption that had to be actively resisted. The armor worn by Nightfarers served multiple purposes beyond simple physical protection. In addition to defending against conventional attacks, it provided psychological shielding that helped its wearer maintain clear distinctions between their own thoughts and the alien influences that pervaded nightmare-touched environments. The most effective armor incorporated symbols and patterns that had been discovered in pre-Golden Order texts, designs that seemed to have natural protective properties against entities from outside normal reality. The development of Nightfarer equipment required the establishment of specialized workshops and forges that could safely handle the dangerous materials involved in the creation process. These facilities had to be located in areas where the boundary between normal reality and nightmare realms was thin enough to allow access to the necessary materials, but stable enough to prevent the craftsmen from being overwhelmed by alien influences. The workshops themselves became centers of learning and experimentation, where Nightfarers could share their discoveries and develop new techniques for dealing with supernatural threats. However, they also attracted the attention of the nightmare entities that the Nightfarers were fighting against, leading to conflicts that tested the defensive capabilities of the early communities. These battles were unlike any form of warfare that had been seen during the Shattering. The nightmare entities that attacked Nightfarer settlements did not simply seek to kill or conquer, but to corrupt and transform their opponents into forms of existence that would serve alien purposes. Physical destruction was often secondary to psychological warfare, aimed at breaking down the mental defenses that allowed humans to maintain their essential nature. The Nightfarers' response to these attacks required them to develop new forms of cooperative combat that took advantage of their shared supernatural abilities. Individual warriors, no matter how skilled, were vulnerable to the isolation tactics that nightmare entities preferred to use. But groups of Nightfarers who had learned to coordinate their abilities could create defensive networks that were much more difficult for alien forces to penetrate. The most effective Nightfarer tactics involved the creation of reality anchors, stable points in space and time that could serve as refuges during battles with entities that sought to manipulate the fundamental nature of existence itself. These anchors were established through group rituals that combined the supernatural abilities of multiple Nightfarers with artifacts that had proven effective in maintaining stability in nightmare-influenced environments. The establishment of reality anchors also allowed the Nightfarers to begin mapping the extent of nightmare influence throughout the post-Shattering realm. By creating networks of stable points, they could begin to understand the patterns according to which the alien forces were spreading and identify areas where intervention might be most effective. This mapping effort revealed that the nightmare influences were not spreading randomly, but were following specific pathways that connected to sources of power that had been established during the cosmic crisis. The locations where great rune bearers had fallen, the sites of the most devastating battles of the Shattering, and the areas where reality had been most severely damaged, all served as focal points for alien activity. The discovery of these patterns allowed the Nightfarers to begin developing strategic approaches to their resistance efforts. Rather than simply responding to threats as they appeared, they could begin to anticipate where nightmare influences were likely to manifest next and position themselves to intervene before the corruption became too well established to counter. However, this strategic thinking also revealed the full scope of the challenge they faced. The nightmare forces were not simply chaotic phenomena that could be contained through sufficient effort. They were part of a larger pattern of cosmic change that had been set in motion by the Shattering itself. The transformation of the lands between into a realm where nightmare and reality coexisted was not something that could be simply reversed, but would have to be accepted and adapted to. This realization forced the early Nightfarer communities to confront difficult questions about their ultimate goals and methods. Were they fighting to restore something resembling the old order, or were they trying to create something entirely new? Could they hope to eliminate the nightmare influences entirely, or would they have to find ways to coexist with forces that would never be fully compatible with human consciousness? The answers to these questions would determine not only the fate of the Nightfarer communities themselves, but the future of all life in the post-Shattering realm. The choices made by the first generation of Nightfarers would establish the foundations for whatever forms of civilization might eventually emerge from the cosmic chaos that had consumed their world. Chapter 12. The Liminal Realm. As the influence of the Night Lords grew stronger and the barriers between realities continued to weaken, a new landscape began to emerge from the ruins of the old world. This realm, which would come to be known as Limveld, existed in the spaces between the familiar territories of the lands between and the alien dimensions, from which the nightmare forces originated. It was neither fully real nor entirely imaginary, but rather a transitional space where the rules of both realms applied simultaneously, creating conditions that were as opportunities as they were dangerous. The formation of Limveld was not a sudden event, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over several years as the cosmic wounds left by the Shattering slowly healed in ways that incorporated the alien influences that had taken root in them. Areas that had been completely devastated by the war began to regenerate, but the new landscapes that emerged bore little resemblance to what had existed before. In Limveld, the familiar geography of the lands between was overlaid with structures and features that followed the logic of nightmare realms. Ancient ruins that had been destroyed during the Shattering reappeared in forms that incorporated architectural elements from dimensions where space and time functioned according to different principles. Forests grew where trees that had never existed in the material realm produced fruits that could nourish both body and spirit, but only for those who had been touched by supernatural forces. The most distinctive feature of Limveld was its temporal instability. Different regions experienced the passage of time at varying rates, creating a landscape where travelers might spend days in one area only to discover that years had passed in the outside world, or conversely, where intensive journeys that felt like they had lasted for weeks turned out to have taken only hours in normal time. This temporal variability was not random, but followed patterns that reflected the influence of the Night Lords, who had begun to claim dominion over different parts of the transitional realm. Each of these entities imposed its own interpretation of how time and space should function, creating pockets of reality that operated according to principles derived from their alien consciousness. The first Night Lords to establish themselves in Limveld were beings of immense power and intelligence who had existed for eons in dimensions where the concepts of hunter and prey were the only meaningful forms of organization. Their consciousness was structured around the eternal pursuit of worthy opponents, and they found in the post-Shattering world an opportunity to create hunting grounds that could provide them with the challenges they craved. Unlike the chaotic destruction that had characterized the Shattering itself, the transformation that the Night Lords brought to their territories was purposeful and artistic. They reshaped landscapes to create environments that would test the abilities of any beings brave enough to enter their domains, while populating these areas with creatures and challenges that reflected their own twisted aesthetics. The result was a realm that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, where magnificent vistas and architectural wonders served as backdrops for trials that could easily destroy anyone who approached them without proper preparation. The Night Lords had no interest in simply killing intruders. They wanted to create experiences that would test the limits of courage, skill, and determination. For the Nightfarers who had developed the ability to perceive and interact with entities from nightmare realms, Limveld represented both an unprecedented opportunity and an existential threat. The transitional nature of the realm meant that it was one of the few places where they could operate at full effectiveness, using their supernatural abilities without the constant resistance they encountered in areas that remained anchored to normal reality. However, the same properties that made Limveld accessible to the Nightfarers also made it extremely dangerous for anyone who had not undergone the proper transformations. Ordinary humans who entered the transitional realm without protection typically succumbed to madness within hours, as their minds proved incapable of processing the conflicting signals they received from environments that operated according to multiple sets of physical laws. Simultaneously, the creatures that inhabited Limveld were as varied and strange as the landscapes they roamed. Some were remnants of the original inhabitants of the lands between, transformed by prolonged exposure to nightmare influences into forms that bore little resemblance to their original nature. Others were entities that had emerged spontaneously from the interaction between material reality and alien consciousness, beings that had never existed in any pure form but represented hybrid states that incorporated elements from multiple dimensions. Perhaps most disturbing were the echoes, shadowy duplicates of individuals who had died during the Shattering, preserved in Limveld as semi-conscious memories that retained fragments of their original personalities while serving the purposes of whatever Night Lord claimed dominion over their area. These echoes could provide valuable information about the past, but they were also unreliable narrators whose accounts of events were filtered through the alien perspectives of their current masters. The first Nightfarer expeditions into Limveld were tentative affairs, small groups of experienced warriors who ventured into the transitional realm for brief periods to gather intelligence about the forces that were establishing themselves there. These early missions revealed both the tremendous potential that the realm offered and the extreme dangers that it posed to anyone who approached it without proper respect for its alien nature. The most successful early expeditions were those that approached Limveld not as a territory to be conquered, but as a living entity to be negotiated with. The realm itself seemed to respond to the intentions and attitudes of those who entered it, offering greater safety and more valuable rewards to individuals who demonstrated understanding of its unique nature. This discovery led to the development of new protocols for Nightfare operations in the transitional realm. Rather than attempting to impose their will upon the alien landscapes, successful teams learned to adapt their goals and methods to the specific conditions they encountered in each area. This flexibility required a form of psychological discipline that was even more demanding than the mental techniques needed to resist nightmare corruption. The establishment of permanent Nightfarer outposts in Limveld marked a crucial turning point in the post-Shattering period. These bases provided secure staging areas for deeper expeditions into the transitional realm, while also serving as centers for the study and cataloging of the new forms of existence that were emerging from the interaction between material and nightmare forces. The most important of these outposts was established in a region that had once been part of the Great Library of Raya Lucaria, The cosmic forces that had destroyed the original academy had somehow preserved fragments of its knowledge, while transforming them into forms that could be accessed by beings with nightmare-touched consciousness. This hybrid repository contained information about both the old world and the new realities that were emerging from its ruins. The scholars who worked at this facility, all of whom had undergone the transformations necessary to function in Limveld, began to piece together a comprehensive understanding of what was happening to their world. Their research revealed that the changes brought about by the Shattering were not merely destructive, but represented a fundamental evolution in the nature of existence itself. According to their findings, the cosmic order that had been established by the Greater Will had always been artificial and temporary, an imposed structure that had suppressed the natural tendency of reality to incorporate influences from multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Shattering had not destroyed the world, but it allowed it to return to a more complex and dynamic state that reflected its true nature. This perspective suggested that the nightmare influences and alien consciousness that were manifesting throughout the realm were not invasive forces to be eliminated, but natural components of a more complete and sophisticated form of existence. The challenge facing the inhabitants of the post-Shattering world was not to restore the artificial simplicity of the Golden Age, but to learn how to thrive in a reality that was inherently more complex and dangerous. The implications of this understanding were profound and controversial. Some Nightfarer communities embraced the idea that they were pioneers in the development of a new form of consciousness that could operate effectively in a multi-dimensional reality. Others rejected this interpretation, maintaining that their primary duty was to protect whatever remnants of humanity could be preserved from the alien influences that threatened to consume them entirely. This philosophical division led to the emergence of different approaches to Nightfarer training and operations. The progressive factions developed techniques that emphasized integration with nightmare forces, seeking to achieve forms of consciousness that could navigate alien realms while retaining essential human values and goals. The conservative factions focused on resistance and containment, working to develop barriers and weapons that could protect unmodified humans from supernatural threats. Both approaches had their merits and their dangers. The progressives achieved remarkable successes in understanding and manipulating the forces that were reshaping reality, but they also risked losing their humanity entirely in their pursuit of transcendent consciousness. The conservatives maintained stronger connections to traditional human values and social structures, but they often found themselves unable to operate effectively in environments where such connections were more liability than asset. The tension between these different approaches was exacerbated by the practical realities of survival in Limvold. The transitional realm rewarded adaptability and punished rigid adherence to any single set of principles, whether traditional or revolutionary. Successful Nightfarer operations required teams that could combine conservative caution with progressive innovation, using whatever methods proved most effective in specific situations, regardless of their theoretical implications. This pragmatic approach led to the development of what became known as the Nightfarer Protocols, a flexible framework for operations in alien environments that prioritized survival and mission success over ideological consistency. The protocols emphasized the importance of maintaining team cohesion and mutual support while allowing individual members to pursue whatever specialized techniques or abilities they found most effective. The success of teams that followed the Nightfarer protocols helped to establish a new form of military organization that was specifically adapted to the realities of post-Shattering warfare. Unlike traditional armies that relied on standardized training and equipment, Nightfarer units were composed of specialists who had developed unique abilities and approaches to dealing with supernatural threats. This specialization was necessary because the entities and challenges that the Nightfarers faced in Limveld were too varied and unpredictable to be countered through conventional tactics. Each Nightlord imposed its own rules and aesthetic preferences on its territory, creating hunting grounds that required different combinations of skills and abilities to navigate successfully. The diversity of challenges also meant that no single Nightfarer could hope to master all the techniques that might be needed for different types of missions. The most effective teams were those that included members with complementary specializations, allowing them to adapt to whatever conditions they encountered, while maintaining the mutual support that was essential for survival in alien environments. Chapter 13. The Eternal Hunt begins. The establishment of the Night Lord's dominion over Limveld created a new form of existence that was unlike anything that had previously been seen in the known universe. Unlike the static perfection that the Golden Order had sought to impose, or the chaotic destruction that had characterized the Shattering, the reign of the Night Lords was based on the principle of eternal dynamic tension between opposing forces. The Night Lords themselves were beings whose consciousness had been shaped by eons of existence in dimensions where the only meaningful activity was the pursuit of worthy prey through landscapes that were designed to test the limits of skill, courage, and determination. Their arrival in Limveld presented them with an opportunity to create the ultimate hunting ground, a realm where the challenges they could offer would be limited only by their imagination and the responsiveness of the reality they now controlled. Each Night Lord approached this opportunity according to its own aesthetic preferences and psychological needs. Some created vast labyrinths filled with puzzles and traps that tested intellectual as well as physical capability. Others designed arena-like spaces where direct combat could unfold according to elaborate rules that ensured maximum drama and spectacle. Still others constructed surreal landscapes where the very concepts of space and time were manipulated to create challenges that existed as much in the realm of consciousness as in physical reality. What unified all of these different approaches was the Night Lords' shared commitment to the principle that true worth could only be demonstrated through overcoming genuine adversity. They had no interest in easy victories or predetermined outcomes. Their greatest pleasure came from witnessing beings who could adapt and grow in response to challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. This philosophy created a form of existence that was inherently educational, though the lessons it offered came at tremendous cost. The hunting grounds that the Night Lords created were designed not simply to kill intruders, but to force them to develop new capabilities and forms of consciousness that would make them more interesting opponents in future encounters. The result was a realm where failure and success were both temporary states in an ongoing process of development and challenge. Beings who were defeated in their first encounters with a particular Night Lord's domain would be given opportunities to return and try again, having learned from their previous mistakes and developed new abilities to apply to the challenge. However, this educational aspect of the Eternal Hunt came with a price that many found unacceptable. The process of developing the capabilities needed to survive in Night Lord domains inevitably involved accepting forms of corruption and transformation that changed the essential nature of those who underwent them. Each success in the hunting grounds moved the participants further away from their original forms of existence and closer to the alien consciousness of their hosts. The Nightfarers who began to operate regularly in Limveld found themselves caught in this cycle of challenge and transformation. Their missions required them to enter Night Lord domains and overcome the obstacles they found there. But each such victory changed them in ways that made it more difficult to maintain connections to the human communities they were supposed to be protecting. This dilemma was particularly acute for Nightfarers, who proved to be especially capable in the hunting grounds. Their successes attracted the attention of the Night Lords themselves, who began to offer increasingly sophisticated challenges designed specifically for their individual capabilities and interests. The temptation to accept these personalized trials was difficult to resist, as they offered opportunities for growth and accomplishment that could not be found anywhere else. Some Nightfarers succumbed entirely to this temptation, becoming permanent residents of Limveld, who served as champions and representatives of the Night Lords who had claimed them. These individuals retained their memories and much of their original personality, but their goals and values were gradually reshaped to align with the alien aesthetics of their new masters. Others attempted to maintain their humanity while participating in the Eternal Hunt, developing techniques for resisting the transformative influences that they encountered while still gaining the benefits that successful participation offered. This balance was extremely difficult to achieve, and required constant vigilance and mutual support from other Nightfarers who understood the challenges involved. The communities that remained outside Limveld watched these developments with a mixture of admiration and horror. The Nightfarers who returned from the hunting grounds brought with them knowledge and capabilities that were essential for protecting the surviving human settlements, but they also embodied changes that made many people question whether the cure was worse than the disease. This tension led to the development of complex relationships between the Nightfarer communities and the settlements they protected. The ordinary humans needed the supernatural protection that only the Nightfarers could provide, but they also feared that prolonged contact with beings who had been touched by alien influences might corrupt them as well. The solution that emerged from these concerns was the establishment of formal protocols that governed the interaction between Nightfarers and ordinary humans. These agreements typically involved the creation of neutral zones where the two groups could meet and exchange information without exposing the unmodified humans to direct contact with nightmare influences. The neutral zones also served as recruitment centers where individuals who had been identified as having the potential to become Nightfarers could undergo the initial stages of transformation in relatively controlled conditions. This process helped to ensure a steady supply of new hunters, while also providing opportunities for people to understand exactly what they would be sacrificing if they chose to pursue that path. The recruitment and training of new Nightfarers became an increasingly sophisticated process as the communities gained experience with the transformation procedures. The early random exposures to nightmare influences were replaced by carefully controlled rituals that maximized the chances of successful transformation, while minimizing the risk of complete corruption or death. These rituals drew on knowledge that had been preserved from pre-Golden Order traditions, combined with insights gained through direct experience with the entities and forces that now dominated Limveld. The most effective procedures involved gradual exposure to increasing levels of nightmare influence, allowing the candidate's consciousness to adapt slowly rather than being overwhelmed by sudden contact with alien forces. The training that followed successful transformation was equally complex and demanding. New Nightfarers had to learn not only how to use their supernatural abilities effectively, but also how to maintain their essential humanity while operating in environments that were designed to erode human consciousness. This education required both practical instruction in survival techniques and philosophical guidance in maintaining personal identity under extreme psychological pressure. The development of Nightfarer training programs also led to the emergence of specialized roles within the hunter communities. Some individuals proved to be particularly effective at teaching others how to resist corruption, while others excelled at developing new weapons and equipment for use in alien environments. Still others became experts in the study and classification of the various entities and phenomena that populated Limveld. This specialization allowed the Nightfarer communities to become more effective and efficient in their operations, but it also created new forms of dependency and vulnerability. The loss of key specialists could cripple entire communities, while the concentration of important knowledge in the hands of a few individuals created risks that had not existed when every Nightfarer was expected to be self-sufficient in all areas. The most successful communities addressed these challenges by developing comprehensive systems for sharing and preserving knowledge. Written records were supplemented by practical demonstrations and apprenticeship programs that ensured that important techniques would not be lost if their original developers were killed or corrupted during missions in Limveld. However, the alien nature of much of the knowledge that the Nightfarers had acquired made it difficult to preserve using traditional methods. Information about nightmare entities and techniques for manipulating alien forces could not be safely written down in conventional ways, as the act of recording such knowledge often imbued the records themselves with corrupting influences. The solution was the development of symbolic and metaphorical recording systems that conveyed essential information while avoiding direct contact with the alien concepts being described. These systems required specialized training to use effectively, creating a new class of scholar scribes who served as intermediaries between the active hunters and the communities that supported them. The establishment of these complex support systems marked the transition from the early desperate struggles for survival to a more organized and sustainable form of resistance to the alien influences that had taken root in the post-Shattering world. The Nightfarer communities had evolved from loose collections of individuals with supernatural abilities into sophisticated organizations capable of carrying out long-term campaigns against entities whose power and intelligence exceeded anything that had been seen during the Golden Age. Yet this success came with its own form of corruption. The very act of organizing resistance to the Night Lords required the adoption of methods and perspectives that bore uncomfortable similarities to those of the entities being opposed. The eternal hunt that the Night Lords had established was becoming a way of life for the humans who fought against it, changing them in ways that made the distinction between hunter and hunted increasingly meaningless. This realization forced the Nightfarer communities to confront difficult questions about their ultimate goals and the methods they were willing to use to achieve them. Were they fighting to preserve humanity as it had existed before the Shattering, or were they simply participating in the transformation of consciousness that the alien influences represented? Could they hope to defeat the Night Lords without becoming like them, or was the very attempt to resist alien influence a form of submission to it? The answers to these questions would determine not only the future of the Nightfarer communities, but the ultimate fate of all consciousness in the post-Shattering world. The eternal hunt had begun, and its conclusion would reshape the very nature of existence itself. Chapter 14. The 3-Day Cycle. As the influence of the Night Lords solidified throughout Limveld and their hunting grounds became more sophisticated and challenging, a new pattern began to emerge that would define the rhythm of existence in the transformed realm. The eternal hunt that had initially seemed chaotic and unpredictable gradually organized itself around a 3-day cycle that reflected the alien consciousness of the entities who had created it. The discovery of this cycle was made by Nightfarer teams who had been attempting to map the temporal irregularities that characterized different regions of Limveld. They noticed that despite the varying rates at which time passed in different areas, there was an underlying rhythm that seemed to govern when certain types of challenges would become available and when the Night Lords themselves would become active in their domains. The first day of each cycle was characterized by relative calm and opportunity. During this period, the hunting grounds were accessible to exploration and the gathering of resources, but the most dangerous entities remained dormant or withdrawn. Nightfarer teams could move through even the most challenging territories with reasonable safety, provided they respected the boundaries and limitations that the Night Lords had established. This phase of the cycle became known as the Day of Preparation, as it offered the best opportunities for Nightfarers to scout upcoming challenges, gather intelligence about their opponents, and acquire the specialized equipment and supplies that would be needed for more dangerous operations. The Night Lords seemed to recognize that meaningful challenges required adequate preparation, and they provided this time as a form of gift to those who would soon be testing themselves against their creations. The second day brought increased activity and danger as the entities that populated the hunting grounds began to stir, and the challenges that had been dormant during the first day became active. This was the time when most Nightfarer operations took place, as teams attempted to overcome the obstacles that stood between them and their objectives, while the conditions remained manageable. The Day of Trials, as this phase came to be known, tested all the skills and abilities that Nightfarer teams had developed through their training and previous experience. The challenges they faced were designed to push them to their limits without quite exceeding their capabilities, provided they approached each obstacle with appropriate strategy and preparation. Success during the Day of Trials could yield tremendous rewards. Nightfarer teams that overcame the challenges set for them might gain access to powerful artifacts, acquire new knowledge about the nature of the alien forces they faced, or develop enhanced abilities that would serve them well in future operations. However, failure during this phase typically meant death or worse, capture and transformation by entities that viewed defeated opponents as raw material for their own twisted experiments. The third day of each cycle was when the Night Lords themselves became fully active in their domains. This was the time of greatest danger and opportunity, when the alien entities that ruled over Limveld emerged from whatever dimensions they normally inhabited to personally oversee the challenges they had created. The Day of Reckoning, as this final phase was known, offered the possibility of the greatest rewards for those who proved capable of facing a Night Lord directly. These encounters were not simple battles that could be won through superior force or tactics, but complex tests that evaluated every aspect of a challenger's consciousness and capabilities. Each Night Lord approached these encounters according to its own aesthetic preferences and psychological needs. Some preferred elaborate contests of skill and cunning that could last for hours or even days. Others engaged in philosophical debates, where the stakes were measured in terms of fundamental understanding rather than physical survival. Still others created scenarios where challengers had to demonstrate their commitment to principles or values that the Night Lord found worthy of respect. What united all of these different approaches was their focus on transformation rather than destruction. The Night Lords were not interested in simply killing those who challenged them. They wanted to create experiences that would fundamentally change their opponents, either by elevating them to new levels of consciousness, or by revealing the limitations that prevented such elevation. This transformative aspect of the Day of Reckoning made it both the most dangerous and most valuable part of the 3-day cycle. Nightfarers who survived direct encounters with Night Lords often emerged with abilities and insights that made them far more effective in all their subsequent operations. However, those who failed such encounters typically suffered fates that made death seem like a mercy, transformation into forms of existence that retained their consciousness while serving the alien purposes of their captors. The establishment of the 3-day cycle had profound implications for the organization and strategy of Nightfarer operations. Teams could no longer simply enter Limveld whenever circumstances seemed favorable. They had to carefully time their expeditions to take advantage of the opportunities that each phase of the cycle offered, while avoiding unnecessary exposure to the dangers that accompanied them. This requirement led to the development of sophisticated planning and coordination systems that allowed multiple Nightfarer teams to operate simultaneously in different parts of Limveld without interfering with each other's missions. The limited windows of opportunity meant that every expedition had to be carefully planned and precisely executed to achieve maximum effectiveness. The 3-day cycle also created new forms of competition and cooperation between different Nightfarer communities. Teams that proved capable of operating effectively during the Day of Reckoning gained tremendous prestige and influence, while those who could only function safely during the Day of Preparation were often viewed as junior partners in larger operations. However, this hierarchy was balanced by the recognition that successful operations typically required contributions from Nightfarers with different specializations and capabilities. The intelligence gathering and resource acquisition that took place during the Day of Preparation was essential for the success of combat operations during the Day of Trials, while the insights gained through encounters with Night Lords during the Day of Reckoning could benefit entire communities for years to come. The cycle also had important psychological effects on the Nightfarer communities themselves. The regular rhythm of danger and opportunity created a form of existential discipline that helped individuals maintain their focus and purpose, despite the constant exposure to alien influences that their work required. The anticipation and preparation that preceded each Day of Reckoning served as focal points for community identity and commitment. Teams that were preparing for high-level operations became the center of attention and support from their entire community, creating bonds of mutual dependence and shared purpose that helped to counteract the isolating effects of supernatural transformation. Conversely, the periods of relative calm that followed completed cycles provided opportunities for rest, reflection, and the integration of new knowledge and abilities. These recovery periods were essential for maintaining the psychological health of individuals who regularly exposed themselves to experiences that challenged the fundamental nature of human consciousness. The 3-day cycle also influenced the relationship between the Nightfarer communities and the ordinary human settlements they protected. The predictable rhythm of activity in Limveld made it possible for the settlements to plan their own activities around the availability of Nightfarer protection and support. During periods when most of the active Nightfarers were engaged in operations within Limveld, the settlements had to rely on their own defensive capabilities, and the protection provided by less experienced hunters who remained behind. This requirement encouraged the development of local defensive capabilities and created incentives for cooperation between different settlements. The regular return of successful Nightfarer teams, with resources and knowledge gained from their expeditions, also created economic and cultural cycles that gave structure and meaning to life in the post-Shattering world. Communities learned to time their own important activities around these returns, creating festivals and ceremonies that celebrated successful operations while mourning those who had been lost. Over time, the 3-day cycle became more than just a tactical consideration for Nightfarer operations. It became a fundamental organizing principle for all aspects of life in the regions that surrounded Limveld. The rhythm of preparation, trial, and reckoning provided a framework for understanding time and purpose that helped people make sense of their existence in a world where the old certainties no longer applied. This psychological and cultural adaptation to the alien rhythm imposed by the Night Lords represented a form of success, but also a form of surrender. The human communities that had learned to organize their lives around the 3-day cycle had achieved a kind of stability and prosperity, but they had also accepted a fundamental alteration in their relationship to time and purpose that brought them closer to the consciousness of the entities they were supposedly resisting. The recognition of this paradox created ongoing tension within the Nightfarer communities about the ultimate direction of their efforts. Were they successfully adapting to the new realities of the post-Shattering world, or were they simply being gradually absorbed into the alien consciousness that they had originally sought to oppose? This question became increasingly urgent as the 3-day cycle continued to repeat year after year, creating a form of existence that was stable and predictable, but also fundamentally different from anything that had existed during the Golden Age. The eternal hunt had become eternal indeed, and its participants were no longer sure whether they were hunters or prey in a game whose rules and objectives they could never fully understand. Chapter 15: The Round Table's Return. In the depths of Limveld, where the boundaries between memory and reality had become fluid and permeable, something unexpected began to stir. The Round Table Hold, that ancient sanctuary that had once served as a meeting place for champions of the Golden Order, had been thought lost forever in the cosmic upheavals that followed the Shattering. Yet, as the 3-day cycle became established and the Night Lord's influence grew stronger, echoes of the old sanctuary began to manifest in places where the alien and familiar intersected. The first reports of the Hold's return came from Nightfarer teams operating in regions where the temporal distortions were most severe. They spoke of glimpsing familiar architecture through rifts in reality, catching sight of chambers and halls that seemed to exist simultaneously in the past and present. These sightings were initially dismissed as hallucinations brought on by exposure to nightmare influences, but as they became more frequent and consistent, investigators began to take them seriously. The discovery that the Round Table Hold had somehow reconstituted itself in Limveld was both thrilling and terrifying for the Nightfarer communities. The original Hold had been a place of sanctuary and guidance, where champions could find rest and counsel between their missions. Its return suggested the possibility of re-establishing some form of stable institution that could provide continuity and purpose in a world that had become chaotic and unpredictable. However, the version of the Hold that was emerging in Limveld was clearly not the same as the original. The familiar chambers and halls were overlaid with architectural elements that reflected the influence of the Night Lords, creating spaces that served similar functions but operated according to very different principles. The sanctuary had become something that was neither fully human nor entirely alien, but rather a hybrid institution that embodied the complex relationship between the old world and the new. The first Nightfarers to successfully enter the reconstituted Hold found it populated by figures that seemed to be echoes or memories of individuals who had once served important roles in the original sanctuary. These beings retained fragments of their original personalities and knowledge, but they had been transformed by their existence in Limveld into something that was more than mere ghosts, but less than fully living entities. The most significant of these figures was an entity that appeared to be based on the memories of the original Hold's coordinator, but which now served as an interface between the Nightfarer communities and the alien consciousness that had claimed dominion over the realm. This being, which came to be known as the Keeper of the Long Hunt, possessed vast knowledge about both the old world and the new realities that were emerging from its transformation. The Keeper's primary function was to serve as a guide and advisor for Nightfarers who were attempting to understand their role in the eternal hunt that had become the organizing principle of existence in Limveld. Unlike the simple mission assignments that had characterized the original Hold, the guidance offered by the Keeper was complex and often cryptic, requiring deep thought and careful interpretation to understand fully. The reconstituted Hold also contained chambers and facilities that had no counterpart in the original sanctuary. These spaces were designed to support activities and capabilities that had not existed during the Golden Age, providing resources for Nightfarers who needed to develop new forms of consciousness and ability to survive in the transformed realm. One of the most important of these new facilities was the Hall of Echoes, where Nightfarers could safely interact with memories and impressions that had been preserved from the time of the Shattering. These encounters allowed them to gain insights into the events that had shaped their world, while avoiding the psychological contamination that direct exposure to such traumatic memories might cause. Another crucial addition was the Chamber of Trials, where Nightfarers could test their abilities against controlled versions of the challenges they would face in the Night Lord's hunting grounds. These practice sessions were essential for developing the skills and confidence needed to survive encounters with entities that could destroy unprepared minds as easily as unprepared bodies. Perhaps most significant was the Observatory of Intentions, a space where experienced Nightfarers could study the patterns and purposes that drove the alien consciousness they faced. This facility provided tools for understanding the aesthetic and philosophical principles that governed the behavior of the Night Lords, knowledge that was essential for anyone who hoped to engage with them successfully. The presence of these specialized facilities made the reconstituted Hold invaluable to the Nightfarer communities, but it also created new forms of dependency and vulnerability. Access to the Hold required acceptance of its hybrid nature and submission to the guidance of entities that were neither fully human nor entirely trustworthy. The Keeper of the Long Hunt, despite its apparent helpfulness, clearly served purposes that extended beyond simple support for human resistance to alien influence. Its advice often encouraged Nightfarers to take risks and pursue challenges that served the entertainment needs of the Night Lords, as much as the survival needs of the human communities. This ambiguity created ongoing debates within the Nightfarer communities about how much they should rely on the resources that the reconstituted Hold offered. Some argued that any advantage in their struggle for survival was worth the risks involved in accepting guidance from hybrid entities. Others maintained that dependence on alien-influenced resources was simply another form of corruption that would ultimately compromise their essential humanity. The compromise that emerged from these debates was the establishment of strict protocols governing interaction with the Hold and its inhabitants. Nightfarers were encouraged to use the facilities and guidance it offered, but they were also required to maintain clear boundaries about what forms of assistance they would accept and what prices they were willing to pay for such help. These protocols were enforced through peer review and community oversight, with experienced Nightfarers taking responsibility for monitoring newer members who might be more susceptible to the subtle corruptions that prolonged contact with the Hold could produce. The goal was to gain the benefits of the Sanctuary's resources while minimizing the risk of losing essential human perspectives and values. The reconstituted Hold also served as a center for coordination between different Nightfarer communities that had previously operated in isolation. The neutral ground it provided allowed groups with different philosophies and methods to share information and resources without compromising their independence or core principles. This coordination function became increasingly important as the challenges presented by the Night Lords grew more sophisticated and demanding. Individual communities often lacked the resources and expertise needed to address the full range of threats they faced, but cooperation between multiple groups could provide the diversity of capabilities that complex operations required. The Hold's role as a coordination center also helped to establish common standards and practices that improved the overall effectiveness of Nightfarer operations. Techniques and knowledge that had been developed by one community could be shared with others, while successful strategies could be adapted to different circumstances and environments. However, this standardization also created risks that concerned some of the more independent Nightfarer groups. The sharing of methods and knowledge could make different communities more similar to each other, reducing the diversity of approaches that had previously been one of their greatest strengths in dealing with unpredictable alien challenges. The presence of the Keeper and other hybrid entities in the coordination process also meant that information and strategies were being influenced by perspectives that were not entirely human. This influence might be beneficial in terms of understanding alien psychology and motivation, but it also created the possibility that human resistance efforts were being subtly guided in directions that served alien rather than human interests. These concerns led to the development of additional protocols that governed what types of information could be shared through the hold and what decisions could be made based on guidance from its hybrid inhabitants. The goal was to maintain the benefits of coordination while preserving the independence and authenticity of human decision-making processes. The reconstituted Roundtable hold represented both the greatest achievement and the greatest challenge that the Nightfarer communities had faced since their formation. It provided resources and capabilities that were essential for their survival and success, but it also embodied the fundamental ambiguity of their situation, caught between resistance to alien influence and dependence on alien resources for their continued existence. The choices that the Nightfarer communities made about how to relate to the hold would ultimately determine whether they remained recognizably human agents pursuing their own goals, or whether they became willing participants in a larger process of consciousness transformation that would reshape the nature of existence itself. The eternal hunt continued, but its participants were no longer sure whether they were fighting to preserve something from the past or helping to create something entirely new. The reconstituted hold stood at the center of this uncertainty, offering both sanctuary and temptation to beings who had already traveled far from their original nature in pursuit of survival and purpose. Chapter 16. The Endless Nightfalls. As the years passed, and the 3-day cycle became an established rhythm of existence in Limveld, the influence of the Night Lords began to extend beyond the boundaries of their hunting grounds. The alien consciousness that had taken root in the post-Shattering world was not content to remain confined to the transitional realm. It sought to expand its domain until the entire cosmos operated according to its principles of eternal hunt and constant challenge. This expansion did not take the form of conventional conquest or invasion. Instead, it manifested as a gradual alteration in the fundamental nature of existence itself. The distinction between day and night, which had been maintained by cosmic forces since the beginning of recorded time, began to blur and dissolve as the Night Lord's influence spread. The first sign of this transformation was the appearance of what observers came to call false dawns, periods when the sun appeared to rise, but its light carried none of the warmth or life-giving properties that had once characterized daylight. These pseudo-dawn periods were filled with a cold, silvery illumination that seemed to drain energy from everything it touched, rather than providing the nourishment that living things required. As these false dawns became more frequent, the periods of true darkness also began to change. Night no longer brought simple absence of light, but became an active presence that pressed against the boundaries of consciousness and reality. During these enhanced nights, the barriers between different planes of existence became permeable, allowing entities and influences from nightmare realms to manifest directly in the material world. The transformation was not uniform across all regions. Areas that had been heavily influenced by the Great Runes during the Shattering showed different patterns of change, while locations that had remained relatively untouched by supernatural forces sometimes retained fragments of normal day-night cycles long after surrounding regions had been transformed. However, the overall trend was clear and inexorable. The cosmos was gradually being reshaped to reflect the aesthetic preferences of entities whose consciousness had been formed in dimensions where eternal night and endless hunting were the only meaningful forms of existence. This transformation had profound implications for all forms of life in the affected regions. Plants and animals that had evolved to depend on regular cycles of light and darkness found themselves struggling to survive in an environment where such cycles no longer existed. Many species simply died out, while others underwent rapid evolutionary changes that allowed them to function in the altered conditions. Human communities faced even more complex challenges. The psychological rhythms that had governed their lives for countless generations were disrupted by the loss of predictable day-night cycles. Sleep became irregular and dangerous, as the enhanced nights brought with them influences that could corrupt dreams and memories. The breakdown of normal temporal rhythms also affected social and economic systems that had been built around the assumption of regular cycles of activity and rest. Agricultural practices that had sustained human civilization for millennia became impossible when crops could not depend on consistent periods of sunlight and darkness. The Nightfarer communities paradoxically found themselves better adapted to these changes than the ordinary human settlements they protected. Their training and transformation had already accustomed them to operating in environments where normal rules did not apply, and their supernatural abilities actually functioned more effectively during the enhanced nights than they had during periods of conventional darkness. This reversal of capability created new tensions between the Nightfarer communities and the settlements they served. The ordinary humans became increasingly dependent on their supernatural protectors for basic survival, while the Nightfarers found themselves growing more powerful and capable as the world transformed around them. Some Nightfarer groups embraced this development, seeing it as validation of their choice to accept alien influences in exchange for enhanced capabilities. They argued that the transformation of the world simply made their approach to existence more relevant and valuable than traditional human ways of life. Others were troubled by the implications of their growing power and influence. They had originally sought to protect human civilization from alien corruption, but now they found themselves becoming the dominant force in a world where traditional humanity could barely survive. This tension was exacerbated by the fact that the enhanced nights brought with them opportunities for Nightfarers to develop new abilities and forms of consciousness that went far beyond what they had previously thought possible. The alien influences that pervaded the darkness offered forms of knowledge and power that were genuinely beneficial, but accepting them required further movement away from human nature and values. The most profound changes occurred during what came to be known as the Deep Nights, periods of enhanced darkness that lasted for weeks or months, rather than the few hours that normal nights had encompassed. During these extended periods, the boundaries between reality and nightmare became so thin that they were effectively meaningless. In the Deep Nights, the hunting grounds that the Night Lords had created in Limveld expanded to encompass entire continents. Ordinary landscapes became testing grounds, where survival required not just physical capability, but psychological resilience and spiritual strength. The very act of remaining conscious and coherent during these periods was a challenge that tested the limits of human mental endurance. The Nightfarers who learned to thrive during the Deep Nights developed capabilities that bordered on the supernatural, even by the standards of their already transformed consciousness. They could navigate through realities that shifted and changed moment by moment, communicate with entities that existed primarily as thoughts or emotions, and manipulate the fundamental forces that governed existence in the enhanced darkness. However, these capabilities came at the cost of making the Nightfarers increasingly alien to their own origins. The consciousness required to function effectively during the Deep Nights was so different from normal human awareness that individuals who developed it often found themselves unable to relate to or communicate with beings who retained more conventional forms of consciousness. This development created a new category of Nightfarer, beings who had become so specialized for existence in the enhanced nights that they could no longer function effectively during periods of normal reality. These Deep Night specialists were tremendously valuable during the extended periods of darkness, but they became increasingly isolated and dependent on their communities for support during whatever periods of conventional existence still occurred. The emergence of deep night specialists forced the Nightfarer communities to confront difficult questions about the ultimate direction of their evolution. Were these individuals pioneers of a new form of consciousness that would eventually become necessary for all humanity, or were they cautionary examples of how far transformation could go before the essential nature of human existence was lost entirely? The communities that supported deep night specialists found themselves changing to accommodate the needs and capabilities of these enhanced individuals. Traditional social structures and decision-making processes had to be modified to account for the input of beings whose consciousness operated according to fundamentally different principles. Some communities developed hybrid forms of organization that allowed both conventional and enhanced individuals to contribute their respective capabilities to collective decisions. Others separated into distinct groups that specialized in different aspects of existence in the transformed world. The most successful adaptations seemed to be those that maintained flexibility and avoided committing entirely to any single approach to the challenges they faced. The world was changing too rapidly and unpredictably for rigid systems to remain effective for long periods. As the endless night continued to expand its influence, it became clear that the transformation was not merely a temporary crisis that would eventually resolve itself. The alien consciousness that was reshaping reality had established itself as a permanent feature of existence, and all life would have to adapt to the new conditions or face extinction. This realization marked the end of any hope that the old world could be restored, or that the changes brought about by the Shattering could be reversed. The Golden Age was not just over, it had become irrelevant to the forms of existence that were emerging from the cosmic transformation. The night that was falling over the world was not temporary but eternal, and those who would survive it would have to become something new, something that had never existed before in any reality that mortal consciousness could comprehend. Epilogue. The legacy of Night's reign. And so we reach the end of our journey through the vast timeline that spans from the golden perfection of Marika's empire to the eternal darkness of the Night's reign. What began as a mother's grief-driven act of cosmic rebellion had ultimately transformed not just a realm but the very nature of existence itself. The lands between that had once basked in the Erdtree's golden light were gone forever, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous, a reality where nightmare and dream, hunter and prey, human and alien coexisted in an endless dance of challenge and transformation. The Night's reign was not simply the victory of dark forces over light, but the establishment of an entirely new form of cosmic order based on principles that the Golden Order had never imagined. The Nightfarers who emerged from this transformation represented humanity's greatest adaptation and its greatest sacrifice. They had gained the power to survive and even thrive in a reality that would have destroyed their ancestors, but only by accepting changes that fundamentally altered what it meant to be human. They were no longer the same species that had once knelt before Queen Marika in the golden halls of Lendel, yet they carried within them something essential that preserved the possibility of growth, choice, and meaning in a cosmos that had seemed to offer only chaos and dissolution. The 3-day cycle that governed their existence was both a prison and a liberation. It bound them to the aesthetic preferences of alien consciousness, forcing them to participate in eternal hunts that served purposes they could never fully understand. Yet it also provided structure and meaning in a world where such things had become precious beyond measure. The cycle created opportunities for genuine achievement and growth, even if the context of that achievement was shaped by forces that remained fundamentally alien to human understanding. The reconstituted Round Table Hold stood as a symbol of this fundamental ambiguity. It offered sanctuary and guidance to those who needed it most, but only by accepting the hybrid nature of existence in the transformed world. The very help it provided came at the cost of acknowledging that pure human solutions were no longer adequate to the challenges that consciousness faced in the post-Shattering reality. Perhaps most significantly, the Night's reign demonstrated that destruction and creation were not opposites, but complementary aspects of a single cosmic process. The Shattering had indeed destroyed the Golden Order and everything that had depended on it, but from that destruction had emerged possibilities that had never existed before. The eternal hunt was not simply a form of cosmic predation, but a process of continuous evolution that tested and strengthened whatever forms of consciousness proved capable of adapting to its demands. The Night Lords themselves remained mysterious figures, whose ultimate purposes and origins were never fully revealed. They appeared to be entities whose consciousness had been shaped by eons of existence, in realities where different principles governed the relationship between thought and existence. Their arrival in the material realm was not an invasion, but an offering, an opportunity for local forms of consciousness to transcend their limitations and achieve new forms of capability and understanding. Whether this opportunity represented genuine liberation or subtle enslavement remained an open question that each individual consciousness had to answer for itself. The Nightfarers, who thrived in the transformed reality, had clearly gained tremendous capabilities and insights, but they had also accepted constraints and obligations that bound them to patterns of existence that were not entirely of their own choosing. The ordinary human settlements that survived under Nightfarer protection faced their own complex choices about how much change they were willing to accept in exchange for continued existence. The world had become too dangerous for unmodified human consciousness to navigate safely, yet the modifications that would provide protection also promised to transform their essential nature in ways that might eliminate everything they were trying to preserve. The legacy of the Night's reign extended far beyond the immediate consequences for the inhabitants of the transformed realm. The cosmic precedent that had been established suggested that similar transformations might be possible in other realities, where the conditions were right. The barriers between different planes of existence had been permanently weakened, creating possibilities for further expansion of the principles that now governed Limveld. Future generations would inherit a cosmos where the assumption of stable, predictable reality could no longer be taken for granted. They would have to develop forms of consciousness and organization that could adapt to rapid change and constant challenge, while somehow preserving whatever values and purposes they deemed essential to their continued existence as meaningful beings. The story of how the Golden Empire of the Lands Between became the nightmare realm of eternal hunt served as both warning and inspiration for anyone who would face similar challenges. It demonstrated that even the most apparently stable and beneficial forms of cosmic order could be overthrown by sufficient will and knowledge, but also that the consequences of such overthrow were likely to be far more complex and unpredictable than their architects intended. Rani's original vision of liberation from cosmic fate had been achieved, but the freedom that resulted was far stranger and more demanding than anything she had imagined. The beings who now existed in the Night's reign were indeed free from predetermined destiny, but only because they lived in a reality where constant vigilance and adaptation were the prices of continued existence. The great runes that had once been fragments of cosmic law had become seeds of transformation that continued to influence reality in ways that their original bearers had never intended. The power they represented was still present in the world, but it now served purposes that transcended the individual ambitions and desires that had originally claimed it. The environmental devastation wrought by the Shattering had been transformed into landscapes of alien beauty and terrible purpose. The scarred battlefields and corrupted domains had become integral parts of the hunting grounds, where consciousness tested itself against challenges that pushed the boundaries of what existence could accomplish. Even the abandoned sites where ordinary humans had once lived and worked had become part of the greater pattern that now governed reality. They served as reminders of what had been lost, and resources for those who sought to understand the process of transformation that had reshaped their world. The Night's reign represented not an ending, but a new beginning, the establishment of a form of existence that was sustainable and meaningful, even though it bore little resemblance to anything that had existed before. The eternal hunt would continue as long as consciousness itself existed, providing endless opportunities for growth, challenge, and discovery to beings who possessed the courage and adaptability to embrace its demands. For those who would follow in the footsteps of the first Nightfarers, the lesson was clear. Survival and meaning in a transformed cosmos required the willingness to become something new while preserving something essential from what had come before. The balance between change and continuity would always be precarious, but it was in maintaining that balance that consciousness found its highest expression and greatest purpose. The darkness that had fallen over the world was indeed eternal, but it was not empty. It was filled with possibilities that would challenge and reward any being brave enough to pursue them. The night's reign had begun, and its story would continue as long as there were consciousness willing to participate in the endless hunt for meaning and transcendence in a cosmos that offered both in abundance to those who knew how to find them. Thank you for joining me on this epic journey through one of gaming's most complex and fascinating timelines. The transformation of the lands between from Golden Paradise to Nightmare Realm reminds us why we're drawn to these deep, intricate narratives that challenge us to think beyond simple stories of good versus evil. The Night's reign represents not victory or defeat, but evolution, the eternal process through which consciousness adapts to ever-changing realities, while struggling to preserve what makes existence meaningful. If you've enjoyed this exploration of how divine order can shatter and transform into something entirely new and strange, please consider subscribing to RPG2 Sleep for more deep dives into gaming's greatest stories. Until next time, sweet dreams, fellow travelers in the endless hunt for understanding.